The year the wall fell, the snow began by inches. It crept down from the frost fangs and spilled in slow drifts across the haunted forest, clinging to the black stone of the castles that crowned the wall. Men of the Night's Watch cursed softly as they stamped their feet upon the frosted walks and huddled deeper into their cloaks. The ravens muttered in their tower. Ice groaned in the dark like something alive. On the highest of the wall's remaining towers, Lord Commander Jeremy Blackwood watched the white wind rise. The wall had always sung, the old brother said, a faint, distant music, like steel on stone, a sigh at the very edge of hearing. Jeremy had grown used to it over his 30 years in black. This night the song was wrong. The ice did not sing. It screamed. He stood alone on the high walkway, his beard crusted with rime, his breath a pale ghost in the night air. The torch in the iron sconce guttered and fought as if it too felt fear. Far below, at the gate, he could see the pinprick movement of torches as brothers crossed the yard, their black cloaks tiny smudges against the whiteness. He muttered to the dark, though there was no one to hear it. His gloved hand tightened on the ridged ice of the crenellation. Colder than it should be. Every watchman learned to read the wall as a man read a lover's face. Cracks spoke. Drips whispered. The feel of ice beneath his boots told him what was safe and what was folly. The wall was old but strong, spiteful and stubborn and sure. Until this winter, he had felt its weakness for years now. Airline fractures spiderwebbing beneath the snow. Deep, slow moans from the ancient heart of it. The maester blamed storms and shifting earth. Jeremy had nodded, but some quiet, hard Stark part of him had known better. Though no Stark had worn black in 3 generations. He turned his gaze north. The night beyond the wall was no night at all, only an endless curtain of pale movement. Snow ran in great veils over the forest, swallowing the dark shapes of the trees. The sky was a low, bruised lid. Here and there, threads of ghostly blue light shimmered in the distance, like foxfire over a grave. He had been seeing that light for weeks. The first reports had come from the wandering rangers. Dead men walking, they had said, their eyes blue as noon ice, their flesh pale and cold. They had laughed when they said it, the way hard men laughed at shadows. The laughter had dried the day old Hareth staggered back to the wall with half a hand, his face white as chalk and his black cloak soaked in blood that steamed in the chill. "They don't die," he'd whispered again and again as the maester wrapped his stump. "They don't die, Lord. The sword went through 'em clean through. Fire, we need fire." The ravens had flown south that same dusk. No reply had come from Winterfell yet. Even a king could not race the wind. Ice screamed again beneath Jeremy's boots. He felt it in his teeth. Far below, something deep groaned, a sound like the earth itself waking. He was moving before he knew it, turning from the north, stalking down the narrow stair that twisted through the wall's heart. The steps were slick with rime. The air grew heavier as he descended, thick and strangely damp, as if he were walking down the throat of some enormous beast. The torches on the stair sputtered as he passed, their flames thin and blue. At the bottom, the yard flared before him in a wash of light. Men were moving everywhere, dark shapes against snow. The clang of steel, the hiss of breath. There was shouting too, sharp and frightened, bouncing back from the stone. "Lord Commander," called Maester Willem, his thin gray hair a wild halo of frost. "Something's wrong with the ice. The ground trembled. The sound was distant at first, a faint crackle, the noise of a log splitting in a hearth. It grew. A creak, a groan, a rushing roar. Men stopped where they stood. Ravens exploded from the rookery in a frantic cloud, wings beating the air to black tatters. Jeremy's head snapped up. The wall was breaking. It began near the center, where the ice was thickest and oldest. Jeremy saw it happen as a darker slash against pale, a jagged line racing down from the heights, vomiting blue-white powder in its wake. The crack split stone and snow alike. It leaped across old mortar, crawled around towers like a living thing. Men on the walk toppled with it, small and black, their shouts lost in the roar. "Sound the horn!" Jeremy bellowed, his voice shredding his throat. "All men below, now!" The horn blew once, twice, 3 times, the deep notes wobbling as the tower that held it shuddered. Men scrambled downstairs, stumbled from barracks, spilled into the yard. Horses screamed. The ravens shrieked. The wall's face tore open. The ice ripped away in slabs the size of castles, crushing everything below. The air turned to needles. Snow slammed into the yard in a blinding wave. Jeremy saw one of the old winch towers vanish under a white avalanche, men and stone and timber swallowed together as if they had never been. He did not feel himself fall, but suddenly he was on his knees, snow blasting past him like a river. Men staggered around him, their mouths open, faces pale blurs. Somewhere a man was crying for his mother. It seemed to go on forever, that roaring, that terrible grinding. When it ended all at once. Silence came like a blow. The air was full of ice dust, glittering in drifting curtains. Where the wall had stood was a jagged, broken cliff of blue, casting a ghostly light on the white ruin below. What had been towers and barracks and stables was a churned field of shattered ice and splintered stone. The gate was gone. Jeremy realized that his hands were bleeding. His gloves had shredded without his noticing, the leather torn and his skin raw where he had gripped the stone. He forced himself to his feet. "Everyone who can still stand!" he shouted, voice hoarse. "With me!" A few dozen brothers gathered, stumbling from the drifts. Their black cloaks were gray with dust, their faces pale masks. Some clutched swords, others only bare hands or splintered spears. Maester Willem clung to the yard wall, shaking. "Send the ravens," Jeremy told him. His own voice sounded muffled in his ears, as if coming from far away. "All of them, every last bird. The wall has fallen. The dead are coming. Tell the north. Their wings want high gods, Jeremy. You don't know that." Something moved in the gap. At first, Jeremy thought it was the snow settling. Then he saw the shape resolve. Not quite a man, not quite a shadow, tall and thin and terribly still. Behind it, and behind that, more shapes, ranks upon ranks, a forest of pale spears and ice-bright eyes. The temperature dropped. His breath froze in his lungs. Every drop of sweat on his body turned to knives. "Fire," he whispered, though there was so little of it left. "Get the oil, get." He never finished. The first of the cold shadows stepped forward through the broken gate, and all the stories the old men had muttered in the warmth of the hall proved themselves not nearly dark enough. By the time the last raven left Castle Black, the yard was red and white and black, and the Lord Commander burned on a pyre fashioned from the fallen timbers of his own gatehouse, that he might not rise once the fires went out. The ravens flew south. When the birds came to Winterfell, the snows were only just beginning. King Artos Stark stood in the Godswood when the first bird landed, its black wings stirring the hush beneath the heart tree. The white branches rattled softly overhead. Their red leaves clung stubborn on despite the creeping frost, like drops of old blood. Artos was tall for a northerner, with a face like a carved standing stone and eyes the pale gray of winter sky. A fresh wolfskin cloak rode his shoulders, its fur dusted with snow. In his left hand he held nothing at all. In his right, he gripped the hilt of the great sword he wore at his hip, though he had not drawn it. The old gods were listening. He knew that much. He could feel their slow, nameless attention on his back, in the breath of the wind across the pool, in the creak of root and bark. They had been waiting for a question he had not yet found the courage to ask. The raven alighted on the arm of the heart tree, as though it had perching there its whole life. It cocked its black head, fixing Artos with one beady eye. Snowflakes clung to its wings. "Another," came a voice from behind him. It was his maester, Willifer, a southerner with ink-stained fingers and a blunt nose reddened by the northern cold. "From the wall, your grace. They keep coming. Something is wrong?" Artos finished for him. He had slept badly for weeks now. Dreams of cracking ice, of a blue light flickering in endless dark. I feel it. He lifted his hand, slow and careful, and the raven hopped onto his wrist. Its claws pricked through his sleeve. Tied to its leg was a strip of cracked parchment, the ink frozen mid-spatter. He untied it with fingers that felt heavier than steel. The message was short. It did not need to be long. The wall is broken. The dead come south. All gods help us. There was no signature. The letters were jagged, as if scratched by a man in screaming haste. Artos stared at the words until they blurred. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, low and long. Its voice was taken up by another, and another, until the whole of Winterfell's forested outskirts seemed to sing in answer. "Are we certain?" Maester Willifer asked quietly. The question was foolish, but men reached for foolish questions when they were afraid. Perhaps the Lord Commander exaggerates. The men of the Watch are fond of... They are not, Artos said. He could see Jeremy's face in his mind's eye, stony and solemn from the one time they had met. A decade passed, when the Stark had taken his son to the wall to swear the boy's fosterage. Not this man. Not with these words. Nugay. It could be an enemy's trick. The only enemy beyond the wall is winter. Artos let the parchment fall. It fluttered, dancing once on the cold air, before landing near the black pool and vanishing beneath a drift of snow. The raven on his wrist gave a small, uneasy croak. "What do we do?" Maester Willifer asked. "My king, if this is what it seems, we call the banners." Artos's voice sounded very calm, as if this were no more than a boar in the wolf's wood or Ironman raiders on the stony shore. "Send ravens to my bannermen. All of them. Bear Island, Last Hearth, Carhold, White Harbor, the Dread Fort." He hesitated, then sighed softly. "Even the rills. We will need every sword, whether I like the men who bear them or not. The harvest is only just in. If they are to march in winter, then they will march in winter. Better frozen in mail than frozen in beds." He turned to look at the heart tree. Its pale trunk loomed above him, its carved face a bleeding mask. Red sap had run down from its eyes so many centuries that grooves had formed, like tears frozen in place. "What do the old gods say?" Willifer asked tentatively. Artos looked into the carved eyes and thought of the dreams that had plagued him. A wall spider-webbed with cracks, a child's hand pressed against ice that froze it solid, a white wolf running through a black wood with blue fire in its eyes. Sometimes he woke with the taste of ashes in his mouth. "They say what they have always said," he answered at last. "They say winter is coming." I had not thought they meant it so literally. That night, the King of Winter called his lords to Winterfell. They came in twos and tens and hundreds, banners trailing, cloaks heavy with snow. The great hall filled with fur and steel and the low rumble of northern voices. Light from the hearths painted the beams in flickering gold and hammered the long tables into islands in a sea of shadow. Artos sat on the high seat, his heavy brow shadowed, his greatsword across his knees. To his right sat his brother Edwyle, shorter and broader, his beard more wild wolf than man. On his left was his queen, Lyanna of House Umber, her hair as black as raven wings and her eyes bright and cold. Their son Brandon stood behind them, one hand on the back of his father's chair, the fingers of the other drumming restlessly on his sword pommel. "Lord Manderley of White Harbor," the steward called, and a fat man wrapped in white fur waded forward, flanked by knights in sea-green cloaks. Lord Bolton of the Dreadfort followed, pale and sharp-eyed, flanked by men with flayed men on crimson banners. The hall went quieter at that. The North did not love the Boltons. It needed them all the same. Maeg Mormont of Bear Island, gravel-voiced and broad-shouldered, a bear stitched in green and black on her breast. Uther Umber, called Horsebane of Last Hearth. Cragen Karstark of Carhold. Wylus Risewell, Howland Reed of Greywater Watch. Men and women of the North filled the hall, until it seemed all of winter itself had come to claim a seat. Their faces were rough-hewn, hardened by winds and work and war, their hands used to axes and plows alike. They had seen snows before, long, cruel winters where children starved beside hearths gone cold. Yet something in the air made them listen with a kind of shivering impatience, as if the very stones were waiting. Arto stood. The murmurs died as though snuffed. "Brothers of the North," he said. His voice carried easily to the rafters, as if the hall itself bore his words along. "Sisters, lords, ladies, you know why I've called you. The winter's early," Lord Manderley said, dabbing sweat from his brow despite the cold with a lace-edged cloth. "But we have enough stores for 5 years, by my reckoning. 6, if we're tight-fisted with the bread. We've seen worse. And, not like this," Meg Mormont growled. "Not with the ravens we've had." Artos held up the scrap of parchment from the godswood. The black ink gleamed like frozen blood. "The wall has fallen." The words hit the hall like a fist. "Lies," muttered someone near the back. "Can't be. The wall stood 8,000 years. It's stone and ice, not a living thing," Lord Bolton added, in a voice like a razor kept sheathed. "Walls don't fall. They're pulled down stone by men. Who would pull down the wall? Wildlings. They have no such craft." "The dead," Arto said. His eyes met Roose Bolton's and held them until the other man looked away, as if the king's gaze stung. "The others walked in the time of the first men. They were beaten back. The wall was raised, tall and strong and bound with spells older than any of us. Perhaps those spells have run thin." He shrugged a shoulder, the motion slow and heavy under his cloak. "Whether it should have fallen or not, it has. The ravens do not lie." "Men do," Roose said softly. "Even men in black. You think the Watch sent word that their walls had fallen as a jest?" Edwyle snorted. "Southerners lie for gold and glory. Northerners lie only when drunk, and the Watch has no wine." A ripple of grim laughter moved through the hall, brief and sharp as a spark in dry tinder. "What does it matter?" Meg Mormont snarled, slamming a fist onto her table. "Why it fell? The dead walk. That's the meat of it. My men saw 'em. Pale shadows in the trees, with eyes like blue fire. I got one back alive out of 5. He lost 3 fingers to frostbite in a single night in my own hall, sat by my own fire. If the dead rear coming south, we have 2 choices. Fight or die. Day. The choice isn't always so clean," murmured Howland Reed. The Cranagman's voice was quiet, but it carried, slipping between the louder words like water between stones. "The tales say some bent the knee to the cold when the long night came before, took blue eyes and still hearts in exchange for a kind of life, or what passed for it." Roose Bolton's lips quirked in something not quite a smile. I had heard that too. Artos let the murmurs wash over him for a moment. He felt old suddenly, older than his years. His son Brandon's hand rested steady and warm on the carved wood beside him. He took a slow breath. "The first long night lasted a generation," he said. "You all know the stories. The sun went out, the dead walked. The last hero went seeking the children of the forest, and light was born again out of darkness. Songs and maesters' tales," he added with a faint, wry twist of his mouth. "We no longer have a last hero to send. The children of the forest have been gone from the north for longer than any living man remembers. What we have are swords and spears, walls of stone, and men and women who remember that the north is hard and will not break for any storm." "Nuh, Dundee, rumbled Huther Umber. "I will not sit Winterfell's walls and hope this passes," Artos went on. "If we wait, winter will creep over our fields and through our forests. The dead will fill our own barrows, then rise from them. We will be trapped in these halls like sour ale in a cask, waiting to be drunk dry." His gaze swept the room. "I mean to march north. I mean to meet the dead in the open where we can burn them, where the cold has not yet stolen every breath from the air. I will not allow winter to choose the field." That's folly," Roose Bolton said flatly. "You cannot fight cold. You cannot hack the wind with steel. I can put the edge of winter between my people and its teeth, for as long as I have blood in my veins," Artos replied. His voice did not rise, but somehow it grew heavier. "Will you ride with me, Lord Bolton?" Roose studied him for a moment, pale eyes unreadable. The hall's attention weighed on him like a hand. At last, he inclined his head, a fraction. "The Dreadfort rides," he said, "because if the North falls, there will be no one left to flay." It was as close to a jest as any had ever heard from him. A strained laugh flickered around the hall, then died. One by one, the other lords spoke. "Bear Island rides," Maeg Mormont said fiercely. "We'll show the dead what it means to claw at a bear's den." "Last Hearth rides," Other Umber thundered. "To the bloody end." "White Harbor sails and rides," said Lord Manderley, looking queasy but resolute. "We can bring food up the White Knife, if the river remains open." "Gods grant that it does." "Carhold stands," Cragen Karstark said quietly. "If there are to be songs about this, I'd have my sons' names in them." Greywater Watch had no horses. Howland Reed only bowed. "We will do what we have always done. We'll fight in the swamps, in the slow places. If the dead come that far south, they will find the neck a grave for the living and the unliving both." Artos nodded once. "Then it is done." He looked to his son, Brandon Daught. Brandon Stark was close to 20, with his father's height and his mother's sharp, dark eyes. There was something restless in him, a hungry energy that the walls of Winterfell could barely contain. He stepped forward at once. "You will ride at my side," Artos told him. "You will see what winter truly means, and if I fall, you will stand in my place." Brandon's throat worked. "You will not fall. Kings fall as readily as small folk, when they meet cold steel or colder ice." Artos's voice held no self-pity, only flat knowledge. "You know our words." "Winter is coming," Brandon said. The old phrase felt strangely new in his mouth, as if it had only now found its meaning. "Winter is here," Artos said. "We ride to meet it," the North answered. They rode north beneath a sky of bruised iron. The fields that should have lain brown and sleeping beneath a light dusting of snow were instead buried waist-deep. Trees hunched like old men under white cloaks. The rivers steamed where they still flowed, thin threads of black through a world gone bone-pale. Ardos's hosts spread across the King's Road like a moving forest of spears. Numbers were hard to judge in the drifting snow, but he had the better part of 20,000 behind him when he left Winterfell. Boltons, Umbers, Manderleys, Karstarks, Glovers, Mormonts, Serwins, Tallhearts, Hornwoods, and fierce small houses whose names Southern maesters never bothered to write. Some rode shaggy, ill-tempered northern horses. Others trudged on foot with axes across their backs. Fires burned each night in tight, precious circles, the smoke ripped away by the wind as soon as it rose. The farther north they went, the sharper the cold grew. Men lost fingers and toes in their sleep if they were careless with their blankets. One morning, a squire was found frozen to death a few feet from his lord's tent, his eyes wide and rimed with frost. He had gone to piss in the night and not come back. They burned him with his blankets and his boots, because no one wanted to carry the risk of his body. By the time they reached the gift, the land itself had begun to change. The farms along the King's Road were empty, their doors torn from hinges, their fields churned by flight. Once, near a half-buried village, they found a trail of prints in the snow. Bare, human feet, stumbling one after another, their edges clean in the unending storm. The trail led into the woods and did not come back. Nearby, frozen to the fence of a little godswood, they found a woman with white hair and a child in her arms, both stiff as if carved from ice. Snow had gathered in their lashes, their mouths, filling them up. "Burn them," Artos said, his voice dull. He could feel the dead woman's empty gaze on his back as he rode away. They found the first whites 3 days south of the ruins of the wall. They came at dusk, when the sky had gone blue and shadowless. The snow underfoot was clean and unmarked. The men had just begun to set up the night's fires. The air felt oddly thick, as though full of unseen weight. Brandon was walking the line of horses, speaking softly to his father's big gray warhorse, Winter, when Winterfrost shivered and lifted his head violently, nostrils flaring. "What is it?" Brandon murmured, running a hand down the horse's neck. The horse's skin quivered under his palm, its ears pinned flat. It snorted, breath steaming, and shifted its hooves restlessly. Brandon frowned and lifted his head. The world had gone strangely still. The usual sounds of the camp, the clank of cookware, the mutter of men, the occasional barked laugh or curse, seemed muffled, as if wrapped in snow. The fire nearest him flickered and then bent sideways, like a candle caught in a sudden draft. The hairs on his arms rose. He turned, slowly. They came out of the trees in a slow, stiff procession, like men walking through deep water. Some wore scraps of leather or mail, crusted with frost. Others were naked, their skin a waxy, mottled white stretched tight over bone. Their eyes burned blue. Whites. Brandon's sword was in his hand before he knew it. "To arms!" he bellowed, his voice cracking. "To arms! They're here!" Men jerked awake. Sentries who should have called a warning turned with their mouths open, confusion frozen on their faces, as if they had been standing in a dream. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The dead crossed the snow toward them, slow, steady, relentless. Then the North remembered it was the North. Axes, swords, spears. The nearest men formed a ragged line between the whites and the heart of the camp. Someone snatched up a burning brand from the fire and cast it toward the oncoming dead. It hissed into snow inches short, sputtering. Brandon stepped forward to stand with the front rank. His breath sawed in his throat. He had killed men before, on raiding parties against wildlings, and in the skirmishes against Ironmen that he and his cousins whispered about over cups of sour ale. He had thought himself hardened. The thing that walked toward him with his dead cousin's face shattered that illusion. It had been Clay Serwyn once, a boy Brandon had grown up sparring with in Winterfell's yard. Now its skin was stretched like melted candle wax, its lips split and bloody. Its eyes were pits of icy fire. Its fingers ended in black, brittle nails caked with frozen blood. "Clay," Brandon whispered. His sword hand shook. The thing's head cocked in a jerky, wrong motion. Snow howled around it. It did not answer. It walked on. Brandon's fingers tightened on his hilt until the leather groaned. He thought of his father, of the ravens, of the frozen woman and child on the fence. He thought of Winterfell's towers, the warm light in the windows, his sisters laughing somewhere far south of him. He stepped. The world narrowed to the length of his arm, the weight of steel. The white lunged faster than he would have believed. Its nails scraped his mail with a horrible screech. Its mouth opened, teeth snapping at his throat. Brandon's sword took its head off in a single wild stroke. The body fell. The head rolled, its jaw working, its blue eyes still blazing. The hands clawed at the air, groping for him. They did not stop. "Burn it!" someone shouted. The bones, the bloody bones. Fire. They'd been told that in every tale. Swords alone would not serve. Fire and dragonglass, that was what the old song said. They had dragonglass, in bags of black, glassy shards dragged from the earth on Dragonstone and carried north by white harbor ships at Artos's command. The maester had called it superstition. Artos had called it cheap as stone compared to the cost of being wrong. "Oil!" Brandon yelled. "Torches! Get them burning!" The camp dissolved into chaos and resolve. Whites swarmed among the tents, clawing and tearing, their fingers like cold iron. Men screamed, fought, fell, rose again with blue eyes if they were not burned. Someone's horse broke and charged. trampling corpses living and dead alike, before a white dragged it down by the throat. Ardos came like the storm itself, his sword already wet with something that steamed in the air. He swung, and a white and boiled leather split from collarbone to hip, its innards spilling in a frozen spray that clicked on the ground like hail. It still tried to crawl toward him until Brandon stamped its skull to shards. "Brandon!" Artos' voice cut through the noise. "With me!" Together they carved a path through the dead, father and son back to back. Brandon had never seen his father fight in earnest before. He had trained with him 1,000 times in the yard, seen the measured, patient blows, the corrections, the sharp rebukes. This was different. There was no patience in Ardos now, only a controlled fury, a terrible focus. Every stroke was efficient, every movement purposeful. "Fire!" he roared. "Get the torches to the fallen. Burn them, everyone. Me and I." Torches were thrust into hands, thrust into mouths, thrust into eye sockets. Whites burned with a shrill, inhuman shrieking that raised the hair on Brandon's neck. The smell was worse than anything he had ever known, a stink of rotten meat and frozen earth and old graves. Men gagged even as they swung. By the time full dark fell, the snow around their camp was churned black and red and dotted with pockets of smoldering corpses. The wind carried the smoke away with greedy haste, as if it too despised the smell of the dead. They had lost nearly 300 men. "We were not ready," Ardos said quietly, standing on a rise of snow and looking down at the devastation. "Not for this." Brandon's hands still shook. He flexed them, watching his fingers fight to obey. Blood had dried on his sword hand in a faint orange crust. He could still feel the sensation of Clay's. No, the Whites. Neck parting under his blade. "We knew they would come," he said. "We knew. We just did not know that the stories didn't do them justice." Ardos' mouth twisted. Stories never do. He was silent for a moment. The snow fell around them in slow, thick flakes, muffling the camp's subdued movements. Somewhere men were digging trenches for the dead that could not be burned in time. They would burn them tomorrow, dawn to dusk, until no corpse remained unscorched. The thought sent a scrape of cold along Brandon's spine. "Father," Brandon said slowly, "if the wall truly is gone, if there is no longer any barrier, then the dead won't come in 3s and 5s. They will come as an army. 10,000. 20. More. Where? How can we stand against that, even with all the North at our backs?" "Melnie. And I. And T." Artos' eyes, pale and hard, did not leave the dark line of trees. "Steel and fire alone won't be enough," he said. "They never have been. Not in the oldest stories." Brandon swallowed. "The children of the forest. Aye, and the old gods they served." Artos' jaw clenched. "We have turned our faces from them for a long time. We have knelt at their trees, said the words our fathers taught us, but we have not listened. We have treated them as old stones, comforting because they do not answer." "Manda, you think they will answer now?" "I think," said Artos, "that if they do not, we are all dead, and our bones will march south until the summer sea turns to ice. I think we have nothing to lose by asking." "How?" Brandon asked, voice low. "They've been silent for thousands of years. The last Greenseer's bones are dust. The last children hid themselves away or died in men's wars. How do we ask gods who no longer speak?" Ardos' gaze shifted to him for the first time. There was something there that made Brandon's blood slow, a quiet, terrible consideration. "Blood," the king said. "The old ways always asked blood. They were never shy about the cost of miracles. You would sacrifice. Not you." Ardos turned fully now, and for a moment looked more father than king. "Not yet. I will not spill my air on the snow for the chance of a whispering tree." Brandon tasted ash. "Then who?" "Ask me that again when we have seen the wall," Ardos said. "It may be that I find the answer only there." They marched on. The ruins of the wall rose from the horizon like a mountain shattered by giants. Where once a pale green cliff of ice had stretched from one end of the world to the other, 30 leagues long and 700 feet high, there was now a broken jag of ice and stone. Whole sections had fallen away entirely, leaving only jagged blue teeth protruding from the earth. Others leaned at impossible angles, their faces crazed with cracks. The air here was colder than any Brandon had ever known. It burned his lungs like knives. His breath froze in his beard in an instant, so that every exhale added another layer of ice until he felt he wore a mask. Men coughed blood in the mornings. More than one never rose at all. They found what remained of Castle Black half buried under fallen ice. The gatehouse was flattened. The great oak doors lay shattered like kindling. Barracks had become crushed, timber and stone. Half of the curtain wall was simply gone. Men, too, lay in the ruin. Brothers in black spread like broken toy soldiers across the snow, arms at unnatural angles. Some were missing limbs. Others were half buried, white hands clawing out of the drifts. "Burn them all," Artos ordered, his voice like iron. They built pyres out of the broken beams and the shattered doors. Brandon lit the first one himself. The black cloaks went up quickly, sparks whirling away in the fevered wind. Somewhere among them the Lord Commander slept, but there was no way to tell which scorched body had borne his name. At the very base of the wall, where the ice had split away from the earth, they found something else. It was a ring of black stone, half exposed, half buried in the frozen ground. Each stone was carved, worn so smooth by time that the shapes were almost gone. Here, a weeping face. There, a wolf's head. A spiral. A cluster of 5-pointed leaves. Old symbols? Older than the first men? Older perhaps than the wall itself. "What is it?" Brandon whispered, kneeling beside the nearest stone. His breath plumed over it, then froze and clung. "Foundations," said a voice. It was not his father's. Brandon looked up sharply. An old man stood by the broken edge of the wall, the wind tearing at his patched brown cloak. His face was all wrinkles and scars, his nose a flattened knob, his gray hair thin and tangled. He leaned on a weirwood staff, the white wood polished by long use. His eyes were milky, as if blind. No one had seen him approach. No one had called a challenge. He was simply there. Steel hissed as a dozen men drew swords. "Who are you?" Artos demanded, stepping between the stranger and his men. His own blade was bare, its pale Valyrian steel drinking the cold light. "Once," the old man said, "I was called Leaf Brother. Once, they called me Seer. Once, I had another name, a man's name, before I went into the dark trees and ate their sap and let their roots grow through my flesh." His smile was a deep... "Now I am only old." "Are you human?" someone muttered. The old man laughed softly. "Not entirely." He shuffled closer, ignoring the ring of steel pointed at his heart. "You smell of iron and wolf, King of Winter." The hairs on the back of Brandon's neck rose. "Children of the forest," he breathed. The old man's head turned toward him, blind eyes somehow finding him precisely. "And men," he corrected. "And something that is both. Your blood runs thick with old things, boy." Arto's sword did not lower. "If you are what you say, you could have come when the wall began to fail," he said. "You could have spoken in our dreams, rattled our bones. You could have warned us. Instead, you come when it is already fallen, when the dead already march. Why? Because you did not listen before," the old seer replied mildly. "We whispered to kings in their sleep. They called us nightmares and sought maesters' drafts to keep us away. We bled our sap into your ground. You paved it with stone. We left faces in your trees. You cut down the trees that spoke too loudly. Why should we shout into deaf ears? One, other." Arto's fingers tightened on his hilt. "Because if you do not, you will share our fate when the dead cross the world." Ah. The old man tilted his head. That is why, yes. Brandon stood. Can you rebuild it? He asked, nodding toward the shattered wall. The question burst out of him, as naive and desperate as it sounded. Can the children? Can you call your kind? Summon your gods? Raise it anew in a night? The stories say much, the old seer interrupted. Men's mouths embroidered our deeds until they were fine enough for songs. No, boy. We cannot call mountains out of rivers. We cannot raise in one night what took 100 lifetimes of snow and stone. The wall as you knew it is gone. It will never stand so high again. Brandon's stomach lurched, as if the ground itself had fallen away beneath him. He heard the muted, horrified murmur ripple through the gathered lords. Then we are lost, said Roose Bolton. His voice was calm, almost curious, like a maester noting the progress of a disease. Not lost, the old man said. Not yet. The wall was a wound you drove into the world. Ice and stone and spells together to keep the cold out. It held for long because you fed it, once, with gifts of land, of blood, of oaths. Then you forgot why. The gifts dwindled. The oaths grew thin. The blood that watered the ice was no longer king's blood. The spells cracked like old leather. He ground his staff into the snow. You can no more mend that wall than you can unbreak an egg, but you can make another wound. Ardos's gaze sharpened. How? Not of stone, the seer replied. Stone does not remember. Not truly. Trees remember. Roots remember. Blood remembers most of all. He lifted his staff and pointed to the ring of carved stones. Your first ancestors bound this place in a circle of words you have forgotten. They took our help to raise their wall. This is where the old power touched your world. This is where it can touch it again. Brandon's heart pounded against his ribs, as if it wanted to break free and run. What must we do? He asked. The seer's blind eyes seemed to look through him. One of your blood must give themselves to the trees, he said softly. Wholly. No half measure. No child's game. They must drink deep of the heart tree's sap until their veins run with it. Their flesh must open to the roots. They must let themselves be eaten. In that union, man and wood and old gods, you will have a gate. Not a wall of ice and stone, but a door of living memory stretched across the north. Through that, you may weave a new barrier. Not as tall as the old. His cracked lips curled in something like amusement. But height is not all. Who will step through such a gate if they know every leaf is watching? Silence dropped heavy as snow. What would that do to the man? Brandon forced out. Or woman, the seer said. Or child. It would end them as they were. Their body would wither. Their eyes would turn white and blind to this world. They would walk the green and the gray instead. They would see through crow and wolf, through bark and leaf and stone. Their mind would live as long as the heart of the tree did, and no longer. They would feel the cold that presses now against your lands, like a knife. They might be able to He shrugged a little. If they were not, they would go mad very slowly, and the barrier would break with them. It was the king who broke the silence. You want a king's blood, Ardos said. It was not quite a question. The old man inclined his head. The wall was raised with king's blood. That is why it held so long. That is why it cracked when kings became lords, and lords became men playing at kings and little halls. You bear the old name still, King of Winter. The world remembers that, even if the South does not. Ardos exhaled, white mist. He looked down at the black ring, then up at the shattered wall, then past it, north, where a blue glow pulsed faintly beyond the white waste. Brandon knew that look. No, he said, before he understood had spoken. His voice came out sharper than he meant. Men turned. His father's eyes settled on him. No? Ardos repeated. You cannot, Brandon said. The thought of his father bound in roots, his flesh split, his eyes gone blind and white, was like acid in his gut. You are our king. You are the North. We need you breathing, speaking, wielding a sword. We need you in front of us, not buried in dirt, whispering like a ghost. No. And we need a barrier, Artos said calmly. We need something to stand in the wall's place. Then I'll do it, Brandon said. The words burst out of him like arrows. I am your heir. My blood is your blood. Let the roots take me instead. No, Artos said. It must be someone strong in your line, the seer murmured, almost to himself. Someone who has dreamed. Someone who has heard the whisper in the leaves all their life and pretended it was only wind. The old powers do not open to just any man with the right blood. They must be invited. They must also invite. If they are not willing, the bond will rot. No. Brandon's mouth went dry. Sometimes when I sleep, I see things. Wolves in the woods, ravens on the wall. I thought that was just blood, the old man said. We chose your line for a reason, so long ago that even the trees have begun to forget. The kings of winter have always had snow in their lungs and roots in their dreams. Artos' jaw clenched. Then why not my father? Or his father? Why not generations ago? Why wait until the wall cracked? Nay, because the choice can only be made when the need is great enough, the old man said. Men do not give up their sons lightly, or themselves. It takes fear for the flame to catch. Artos closed his eyes. Brandon watched his father stand in silence, surrounded by broken ice, dead brothers, old stones carved with forgotten faces, and one withered seer who might have been a man once. The wind plucked at his cloak. Snow settled on his hair and beard. It clung and clung, as if the winter wanted to claim him even as he breathed. When his father opened his eyes again, they were harder than Brandon had ever seen them. No, he said once more. Not. My son. Brandon's breath whooshed out of him, half relief and half something like rage. Then, May, Artos said simply. Father. I am old, Artos said. Older than I look. A wry ghost of a smile touched his mouth. Men of the North weather slowly, but we weather all the same. I have 2 sons. You, your brother Edric. I have daughters. I have nephews. I have lords who know how to listen. I have given my life to holding the North against cold and iron. This is only another way of standing the line. Brandon shook his head, snow scattering from his hair. No, you cannot ask me to stand aside and watch you. I am not asking, Artos said. His voice did not rise. It did not need to. I am telling you as your king and your father, you will not take this from me. It is my duty. Tears burned behind Brandon's eyes. He swallowed them back, hard. To weep in front of his men would shame his father's choice. To not weep at all would shame his own heart. You will die, he said. A king of winter dies many times, Artos replied. Once when they set the crown on his head, and the boy he was falls away. Again when he buries his first son. Again when he rides to war without knowing if he will return. If I must die once more, let it be with purpose. He turned to the seer. What must I do? The old man bowed his head. Come with me, he said. Bring your sword. Leave the rest. Brandon reached for his father's arm. I should go with you. Artos caught his wrist and squeezed hard. You will stay, he said. You will command this host. You will hold the line while I go into the roots. If I succeed, you will feel it. If I fail, his fingers tightened. If I fail, take what men you can and run south as far as horses and ships can carry you. The world will end, and you will not outrun it. But you may buy your sisters and your children a few more seasons of sun. You will become king of a dying world. Try to make it die, slow. Brandon stared at him. I won't run. Then you'll die sooner than you need to, Arto said. Stubborn boy. My lord, Roose Bolton said softly, if you must die, let it be with blade in hand, drinking red, warm blood on the snow. This root death is no fit end for a man. If it holds winter back, it is the only end fit for a king, Arto said. He released Brandon's wrist. See that my ravens fly if I do not return by sunrise. He followed the seer without looking back. Brandon watched him go until the blowing snow swallowed him. His father's broad shoulders dwindled, then vanished, and the white world closed around the old man and the king like a fist. He stood there so long that snow piled on his cloak and hair and sword, until he felt he might become another carved, standing stone, one more piece of the north frozen in place. Men came and went around him, their voices low and strange, as if heard through water. Brandon, someone said at last. He turned. It was Lyanna Mormont, his aunt, her scarred face raw with honesty. He made his choice. He had no right, Brandon said. His throat felt scraped raw. He's our king, and he serves his people, Meg replied. That's what a king is for, boy. Nah, pretty songs, not crowns and feasts. Sacrifice, she snorted. We'd all forgotten that south of the wall. Perhaps the gods chose a hard way to remind us. The night was long. Brandon could not sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his father's face, lined and set, and the old blind man's white staff. He saw roots, red and white and black, twining through flesh. He saw wolves howling around a tree whose leaves bled like fresh wounds. He paced the line instead, walking from campfire to campfire, speaking little, listening less. The men watched him, some with hope, some with fear, some with the blank resignation of those who had seen too many winters already. In the deepest hour, when the frail daylight had long since died, a sound rippled across the snow. It was not the shriek of wights or the grinding of ice. It was more like a breath, a long, slow inhalation that ran through the roots of the earth, stirring something ancient in the stones. Brandon staggered, suddenly dizzy. The world tilted. For an instant, the camp around him went gray and distant, like a half-remembered dream. He felt something tug at his chest, as if invisible fingers had taken hold of his heart. Snowflakes hung in the air, motionless. In the stillness, he smelled sap. His vision filled with red leaves. He blinked and found himself standing in a dark wood. The trees around him were great pale soldiers, their bark bone white, their leaves bloody. Faces stared from their trunks, some peaceful, some fierce, some twisted in grief or joy. The ground underfoot was soft with centuries of fallen leaves. The air hummed with low, wordless sound, like the throat song of 100 distant throats. At the center of the grove stood a single hard tree, larger than any he had ever seen, its trunk as wide as Winterfell's tower, its branches clawing at a starless sky. Its carved face wept sap in great, slow tears, staining its bark a deep crimson. Something moved at its roots. Arto Stark sat half buried in the earth, his back braced against the tree. Roots coiled around his legs and waist, pale snakes twining up his chest, thin as hairs where they slipped beneath his skin. His eyes were open and white, their color gone. Sap leaked from the corners like tears. "Father?" Brandon whispered. His voice sounded small in that vast, silent wood. Arto's head turned toward him. His lips moved, slowly, as if speech were a foreign thing he had to remember how to use. "Brandon," he said. His voice was layered, echoing. His own and something older beneath it. A creak of boughs, the murmur of leaves. Brandon fell to his knees, reaching for him. His hands passed through, finding nothing. He was not truly there. Neither of them were. "You did it," Brandon whispered. You bound yourself to the trees." "Yes." Artos blinked slowly. Feel them. All of them. Every root. Every leaf. Every crow's wing that beats over this snow. The wall, his mouth twisted, is a scar now, but even scars can be hardened. I can thicken it for a time, like a man drawing a cloak tighter around his shoulders in a storm. For how long? Brandon demanded. How long can you hold them? Arto's gaze turned inward, as if listening to voices Brandon could not hear. Years, he said at last. Decades if you and yours feed me. If you plant weirwoods where I tell you. If you water them with blood when the time comes. Generations, if your children and your children's children remember why they kneel beneath the red leaves. Me. And if we forget, Brandon asked, though he knew the answer. Then I die, Arto said simply. And the barrier with me. The cold will fill the north as water fills a broken cup. You must not let them forget. Brandon swallowed. His throat hurt. I won't. A faint smile creased Arto's lips. King's words, he murmured. Let us see if you make a king that can keep them. His head tilted, as if he were listening again. The dead press already. I feel their cold on the far side of the scar. They test it as a man tests a door. They will search for cracks. You must not give them any. No. I'll fight, Brandon said. We will all fight. Fighting isn't only swords, Arto said. It's memory. It's story. It's the way men teach their sons to fear the dark and love the fire. There must always be a Stark in Winterfell, Brandon. Not only to hold the walls, to remember. If the line breaks, the North will forget why it stands at all. Brandon's eyes burned. You'll be alone here, he said. Arto's white eyes softened. I am not alone, he said. The wind in the leaves swelled, a soft applause. I have the roots, I have the wolves, I have the snows, and I will have you now and again, when you sleep with your head beneath a heart tree. His hand lifted, or seemed to. Brandon felt the echo of a touch against his hair. Go, Brandon. Go back to your body. Your men are waiting for a king. Do not keep them waiting. Before Brandon could speak again, the grove and the trees and his father's rooted body dissolved like frost in a sudden thaw. He was back on the snow, on his knees, his hands buried in the cold crust. Men were shouting around him, and the air was no longer quite so still. The snowflakes had resumed their falling. In the distance, he heard a sound like 1,000 glass chimes shattering. He pushed himself up, heart hammering, and turned north. The blue glow beyond the ruined wall had dimmed. Above it, high in the gray sky, a faint red shimmer arced from one distant point of forest to another, like the ghost of a drawn bow. It was thin and trembling, but there. What in the seven hells is that? Muttered Huther Umber. Our new wall, Brandon said. His voice did not shake. For a time. In that moment, as he stood on the bones of the old wall and felt his father humming in the roots underfoot, Brandon Stark became king. The war that followed is called many things in the songs that have survived. The long withholding, the winter of wounds, the generational night. Maesters in their stone seats in the south tend to avoid it. It does not fit neatly into their scrolls. The stories in the north are more precise. They say the cold sharpens slowly. They fought not one great battle that broke all at once, but 1,000 small ones that bled the north white over the years. The dead tested the scar in the world where Artos lay buried, probing for weakness. Whenever the old king's strength faltered, they found one. A gap between roots where a weirwood had been cut down centuries ago for a lord's hall. A place where the blood of the first men had thinned too much, diluted by Andal and Rhoynar and Southerner. Through those cracks, the cold seeped like water through a wall. It began with whispers. Winter's worse this year, folk would say in a scattered village on the edge of a pine forest. We'll not plant by the old stones. The ground feels wrong there. The cattle shy from it. Then, one night, a white mist would roll in, and faces the villagers had buried years ago would knock softly on their doors. Brandon sent men where he could. He learned very quickly that he could not be everywhere. The north was too vast, its coasts and forests and mountain valleys too many. He learned to choose, to save White Harbor over 3 forgotten fishing villages, to send steel to the Dreadfort when a cold wind rose from the east, even though he knew that would leave the northern barrows unguarded. He learned what it meant to have men call him cold behind his back. He also learned that his father had not exaggerated the power of memory. Where weirwoods stood and were tended, their faces washed with blood each full moon, their roots fed with the sacrifices of condemned men and willing supplicants, the cold bruised itself against the unseen barrier and slid away. Whites that approached such groves faltered, moving sluggishly, their blue fires dimming. Others, the pale riders of ice who sometimes rode with them, terrible and silent, avoided those places altogether, turning their pale horses aside with expressions that might have been anger or fear. Where the old gods were forgotten, the dead walked more easily. Brandon became gardener as much as general. He sent carpenters into the woods with orders to fell oaks and pines, but spare any tree with red leaves. He ordered new heart trees planted in every holdfast that still owned a godswood, and in those that did not he ordered one made. When southern septons muttered about new faiths and seven-faced gods, he listened with cool eyes and told them they were welcome to preach to the living so long as they did not cut the faces from his trees. He made bargains. He sent his sister Ellen to wed Lord Manderley's heir, so that White Harbor's ships would keep carrying dragonglass and food. He betrothed his younger brother Edric to a Bolton girl, to keep the Dreadfort's cruel steel turned outward. He promised the Reeds that no man would ever build a stone bridge over the neck, so long as a Stark sat Winterfell's high seat, in exchange for their pledge to drown every white that tried to cross their bogs. He fought when he had to. There were battles in the White Knife's frozen shallows, where men swung axes as their legs went numb in water that turned to slush around them, and whites floated like drowned logs until one seized your ankle. There were skirmishes in the Wolfswood, where archers hunted pale shadows between the trees and wolves learned to tear out throats that did not bleed. There were sieges too of a sort, small holdfasts ringed by walking corpses who did not tire, who waited patiently until hunger and despair cracked the hearts inside. Sometimes the barrier held. Sometimes a new weirwood was enough, an old song sung with the right blood spilled at its roots. Sometimes it was not, and then the North lit another village on fire and added more names to their long, bitter rolls. Years turned. Brandon took a wife from House Umber, fierce and laughing, who mocked him for his brooding and taught him to throw an axe as well as any man in her hall. They had 3 children, Artos, named for the rooted king, Lyanna, for his mother, and Torrin, for an uncle who froze on the King's Road, and whose bones walked once before they burned him. On the nights his son was born, and his daughter first stood under a weirwood and looked up without fear, Brandon went to the godswood alone and laid his hand on the heart tree's smooth bark. Sometimes he heard his father. Not words precisely, but impressions. A weariness without end, the sharp, cold pain where the others pressed against the scar like a sword against a shield. The fierce, stubborn flame that was Ardos's, burning stubborn in the roots. "Hold," Brandon would whisper, forehead against the wood. "Just a little longer. They're growing. They're learning. We're teaching them why." There were nights he thought he felt something like amusement in the rustling leaves. Not all of his children heard the roots. Artos the younger was strong and loud and fearless, but when he knelt before the heart tree, he complained that sap made his breeches sticky, and the ravens shat on his shoulders. Torrin was clever and cautious, more interested in the maester's maps and sums than the old songs. Lyanna alone would sit for hours with her back against the white bark, eyes half closed, listening. "What do you hear?" Brandon asked her once. "Stories," she said. She was 9 and missing 2 front teeth, but her gaze was clear. "Wolves, the snow, men who died a long time ago, kings, no, you, grandfather, roots that drink winter like watering a garden. No, Brandon's throat tightened. Do they frighten you? They're only stories, she said. Scary ones. But they mean we're still here. The war took her mother when Lyanna was 12. It was not in a battle, but in a sickness that came creeping with the fog from a ship that limped into White Harbor with black sails and white-faced sailors. The maesters called it a flux. Men burned and shivered and coughed their lungs into bloody rags. Fire did nothing. Dragonglass less. Old gods and new alike seemed deaf. Brandon's wife died with his hand in hers. Her last word was his name, spoken without fear, and he hated the dead beyond the wall in that moment more fiercely than he ever had, for all the struggling and dying he had seen. She should have grown old with him, scolding him for worrying too much. Instead, she lay in a shroud in the great hall, her face thin, her lips pale, while the North's lords came to bow and swear they would revenge a death no sword had made. I thought they would take you with steel, Brandon whispered to her still form when the hall was empty. Not like this. Not out from under me, like a chair leg sawed off in the dark. No, nay. When he knelt beneath the heart tree that night, he did not speak. He pressed his forehead against the bark and let the rage and grief and endless tiredness pour out of him, wordless and raw. The roots drank it as they drank everything. In the far north, in the place where ice and root met, Ardos Stark felt his son's grief and carried it like another stone on his endless stack. He was not alone. Over the years, others had joined him in the roots. Not kings. All Starks, he had insisted on that much, though the old seer had muttered about broader nets, but men and women with the gift. A Karstark bastard who walked in snow like a ghost, a reed girl who had gone into a bog as a child and come out knowing the names of every frog and fish. They lay half buried in earth and ice, their eyes white, their veins pale with sap. Through them, Artos's reach stretched farther. It was not enough. It was never enough. The others were patient. They learned. As the decades wore on, their assaults shifted. They stopped throwing whites mindlessly against fortified holds and began to slip small packs into the spaces between, testing the edges, probing with knives where a hammer would not serve. They learned to twist animals, sending white bears and snowcats with ice in their veins to tear at scouting parties. They learned to stand still as carved ice near the scar and let their cold seep in slow, subtle breaths. Once, Artos felt one touch his mind directly. A spear of cold so pure it almost burned. A presence vast and dark and empty as a starless sky. It brushed against him like a man testing a locked door. Found the latch, pressed until the wood creaked, then withdrew slowly, as if considering. If I falter, Artos thought, if I tire, if I forget why I lie here, it will pour through me like water through a broken dam. He did not tire. He did not forget. But he did feel each winter grow a fraction harder to hold back. When Brandon's hair began to silver at the temples, he called his children to him in the great hall, beneath the carved wolves and the heavy beams. You know what your grandfather did, he said. Yes, said Artos the younger. Everyone knows. Lyanna said nothing. Her eyes were fixed on the heart tree visible through the open doors, its leaves rattling in the wind like 1,000 small hands. Tales have a way of turning into comfort, Brandon said. Soft at the edges. We forget the blood at their heart. I won't let that happen with this. He looked at each of his children in turn. When I am gone, one of you will sit where I sit now. One of you will kneel beneath that tree and hear your grandfather's whisper. One of you, or one of your children, may be asked to go to him, to join him in the roots. No, Torin paled. Father, you can't ask that of us. I can, Brandon said. I must. Without the rooted kings, the barrier breaks. Without the barrier, the dead pour through. It may not be in your time. The old gods willing, it will not be. Artos holds as hard as any man ever has, but he will not hold forever. His mind will fray. He will need another in his place. Or beside. I'll go, Lyanna said before the others could speak. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the crackle of the hearth. Brandon's breath caught. No, Dot. You are my daughter. My only daughter. None. All the more reason, she said with a crooked little smile that reminded him painfully of her mother. Boys forget. Girls remember. We always have. Women keep the stories in their bones, Father. We grow them into our children. We feed them at our breasts. We whisper them when they sleep. If the rooted king needs a rooted queen, I'll sit beside him. You don't know what you're offering, Torrin whispered. I know enough. Lyanna's gaze flicked to her father's face. Do you think I haven't lain awake listening to the roots my whole life? Grandfather speaks more to me now than you do some nights. He wants help. Dawn. That choice need not be made today, Brandon said roughly. Or tomorrow. Or this year. Artos still holds. Perhaps he will hold until all of us are dust and our grandchildren argue about which of their uncle's songs are truer. But you must know that the choice is coming. And you must not run from it as men ran before, snuffing out the trees that frighten them. He closed his eyes briefly. I will not cut a daughter's life short for a war that might wait a century. Not while I still draw breath. Lyanna nodded. Then I'll wait, she said simply. And I'll listen. If the roots call, I'll answer. They called sooner than any of them would have liked. The winter that broke the first Brandon came 40 years after the wall's fall. The winter that broke his son came 30 years after that. The winter that came for Lyanna's generation was worse than either. The sun seemed to bleed more slowly across the sky that year, dragging cold shadow after it. Daylight never warmed more than a dim gray dusk, and the nights were longer than men remembered even from their grandsires' tales. Snow piled against Winterfell's ancient walls until men could walk from parapet to drift without a ladder. The dead pressed, everywhere. Arto's strength in the roots flickered. Brandon felt it whenever he closed his eyes near a heart tree, a faint stuttering in the thread that bound his father to the scar. The red arc in the sky trembled like an old man's hand. In places, it thinned to almost nothing. I am so tired, Artos whispered once in his son's dreams. It was the first time he had spoken of himself in all those years. His voice was still layered with the rustle of leaves, but the human note had grown faint. There is so much cold. Oh, Brandon whispered back, his hands bloody in the dream. Just a little longer. Lyanna is not yet ready. I was not ready when I went into the roots, Artos said. No one ever is. That year, the dead made a push unlike any before. They did not come in scattered packs. They came in a tide. Whites marched across the frozen rivers in ranks that stretched from bank to bank. White bears lumbered at the fore, their fur bristling with icicles. Pale spiders the size of horses scuttled over the snow, weaving webs of frost that snapped men's bones when they touched them. Above them, riding pale, translucent horses, came the others. There were more of them than any living man had seen. They glided across the snow in silence, their armor rippling like the surface of a frozen lake under moonlight. Their swords were slender blue things that smoked with cold. Wherever their pale eyes passed, fire guttered and shrank. They hit the scar near Last Hearth and drove against it as men drove a ram against a gate. Brandon rode to meet them. He was an old man now, his hair mostly white, his beard shot with silver. His hand still held a sword steady, his back still straightened beneath furs and mail. Beside him, Artos the Younger rode grim and silent, his own sons flanking him. The battle was chaos and nightmare, fire and ice, steel and snow. The rooted kings held the barrier as hard as they could, making the red shimmer thicken where the dead pressed hardest. Where it held, whites slowed, their movements jerky, their blue eyes dimming. Where it thinned, they surged through like water through a breached levee. Brandon cut and cut, his arm aching, the pain lost in the greater numbness of cold. He saw a white bear tear 3 men apart before a Mormont woman. Cousin to his long-dead wife, perhaps. It was hard to remember whose children were whose after so many burials. Leapt on its back and drove a dragonglass spear through its eye. He saw a Bolton flare fall beneath a spider's legs and laugh as its fangs broke on his dragonglass breastplate, before the spider wrapped him in ice silk and froze him solid. He saw another ride toward him, its head cocked, pale eyes fixed on his face. He had never been so close to one. It was eerily beautiful, its features sharp as if carved from old glass. Frost clung to its hair like a crown of thorns. Where it passed, the air snapped into breathless silence. It raised its sword. Brandon raised his, and for a moment, their blades met. The shock nearly tore his arm from its socket. The blue steel rang like a bell against his Valyrian sword. Frost bloomed along the blade, racing down toward his hilt. He gritted his teeth and pushed, muscles screaming. Something cracked in his chest. For an instant, he thought it was a rib. Then he realized it was something deeper. The world flickered. He saw for a heartbeat, not the battlefield but roots, red and white and black, thrumming with cold. He felt his father's grip on the scar falter, a hand slipping on ice. The other's pale eyes widened as if sensing the same thing. Brandon did not think. He moved. He twisted his wrist and slid his sword down, letting the other's blade screech past him, close enough to shear through a lock of his beard. He stepped in and drove his sword up under its ribs, seeking not flesh, for there was none, but some imagined heart. The Valyrian steel bit. The other screamed, a sound like shattering glass and winter wind, high and piercing. Its pale body exploded into a storm of ice shards. Its horse dissolved beneath it. All around them, whites within sight of the fall stopped and froze in place, their blue eyes going dark. They collapsed into lifeless heaps. Every man on the field flinched at the scream. In the roots, Ardo Stark's grip slipped again. Brandon fell to one knee, gasping. He felt his own heart stutter, miss a beat, then another. Pain burned down his arm. It took effort to breathe. "Father!" Artos the Younger shouted, falling to his side. Are you... Lyanna," Brandon wheezed. She was already running. Lyanna Stark had always run toward the heart of things. As a child, she had run toward fights instead of away, toward weirwoods instead of hearths, toward wolves instead of hounds. That day was no different. She had felt the barrier flicker from half a world away. She had been at Winterfell, holding the southern line, commanding men on the walls as white mists licked at the outer fields and the water in the well froze solid. She had been speaking with the maester, carefully parceling out the last of the dragonglass, when her knees buckled. She fell against the heart tree. The bark caught her, smooth and cold, her vision filled with red leaves. For a moment she was standing once more in her father's dream grove, roots twining beneath her bare feet. She saw Ardos. He was more root than man now, his face half swallowed by white bark, his hair a tangle of thin, pale tendrils. His eyes were still open, still human, but they clouded and cleared in slow waves, like water in a troubled pool. She saw the others too, Stark cousins, Karstark bastards, Reed daughters, all bound in the same web. Their minds glowed like faint embers among the roots. She saw beyond them, a tide of blue darkness pressing against the scar, cracking it. In one place near last hearth, the darkness had punched through, a fist of black ice reaching for the warm lands. She saw her father fall to his knees, heard the crack inside him echo in the roots. Ardo's voice came to her like a breath through leaves. "I can't hold them all," he whispered. "Too many winters, too much cold. The scar is splitting. I know," Lyanna said. Her own voice surprised her with its steadiness. "I'm coming." She straightened, hands still pressed against the heart tree in Winterfell's godswood, and turned to the men around her. They stared, wide-eyed. "The barrier is breaking," she said. "My father, Our king needs help, and our grandfather has held as long as any man ever could. What can we do? Torin asked, face ashen. He had grown into a thoughtful man, his cleverness tempered by years of ordering rations and counting dead. His hands shook now. You can hold the walls, Lyanna said. You can fight the dead that come. You can remember this, if there's a world left to remember it in. She looked at the heart tree. Its carved face dripped sap slowly, like tears. I'll do the rest. You mean to go to him, Torin whispered. To the roots. Someone sobbed quietly. Lyanna did not look to see who. It's time, she said. He's old. Father's old. She smiled crookedly. I'm not, yet. That will help. Lyanna, Torin said. Please. Tell father I didn't run, she said. Tell him he raised me right. She did not wait for his answer. The old seer, Leaf Brother, they had called him once, though so many leaves had fallen since, was waiting at the edge of the godswood, his weirwood staff in hand. He seemed even more withered than when Brandon had first seen him, his skin thin as parchment, his eyes almost entirely white. I felt you decide, he said softly. I came as fast as my old bones would allow. Will it hurt? Lyanna asked. He considered. Yes, he said, but not for long. And then, not at all. You will feel other things instead, some better, some worse. I'm not afraid, she said. You are, he replied gently. That's good. The roots like courage better when it comes with fear. It tastes more real. She laughed. A short, breathless sound. Any advice? Remember who you are, he said. The trees have long memories. They may try to teach you theirs. Don't let them make you a story and forget the girl in it. Lyanna nodded. They went together to the heart tree. She knelt before it. The carved face loomed above her, bleeding slowly. The ground was cold and soft beneath her knees. Old God, she whispered. Old friends, old enemies. You've watched my family die and live and die again for more generations than I can count. You've drunk our blood for longer. Here's more. She raised the knife the seer handed her. Its blade was obsidian, its edge sharp enough to shave breath. She cut her palm. Blood welled, bright and hot, startling against the cold. She let it drip on the roots. Lyanna Stark, she said. Daughter of Brandon, granddaughter of Ardos, King of Winter. I offer myself, take me, bind me in the roots. Let me hold the scar. Leave my people enough world to bury their dead. The ground shifted beneath her. Roots rose, pale and groping like fingers from the earth. They wound around her ankles, her calves, her thighs, gentle as a lover's caress. She lay back, spreading her arms. Snowflakes whirled above her in the gray sky. The first roots slid under her skin just below her ribs. It was cold, then hot, then both. She screamed. The pain was beyond anything the maester's words held. It was not merely her flesh opening, her veins filling with sap, her bones hollowing to let roots grow through. It was her self-stretching, pulled thin between 1,000 points of bark and leaf and stone. It was every memory she had ever owned. Her mother's rough hands braiding her hair, her father's laugh the day she first knocked him on his back in the yard, the smell of wet dog when her first pup slept in her bed, ripped open and scattered like leaves in a storm. She felt the scar. It was a line of fire across the world, red and raw, where Ardos had driven himself into the wound. It was cracking. Blue cold seeped through the fissures. She threw herself into the gap. For a moment, there was nothing but cold and shouting. A roar of winter so absolute it stripped thought from her. Then she felt the roots, her roots, anchoring her, and she pushed. Hold, she thought. Hold, 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 hold. Something pushed back. The other's presence was immense, but not infinite. It had edges, It had shape. It was cold hunger given will, desire without warmth, purpose without mercy. It did not understand death as men did. For it, to still a heart was simply to add a song to its choir. It pushed not because it hated, but because it was in its nature to fill every void, to frost every river. Liana was small against it, a spark, a leaf in a blizzard. But she was also something it had not expected. She was love, furious and bright, for a land of gray wolves and dark pines and stubborn stone. She was grief, hot and bitter, for a mother lost to southern sickness and brothers lost to northern cold. She was laughter in a hall heavy with snow, children sharing stolen cakes before the call to arms. She was every story whispered by the fire, every warning about things in the dark, every prayer spoken to trees that did not answer. She was memory, and memory cuts. She carved herself into the barrier alongside Arto's. Together, they pushed. On the field near Last Hearth, a red arc in the sky brightened. The cold that had seeped through, turning men's breath to glass and steel to brittle frost, receded a handspan. Whites in mid-charge faltered. Ice spiders cracked, their legs snapping. Another, who had been raising its sword to strike at Arto's, the younger, jerked as if something had caught it by the throat. Its pale head tilted back. Its mouth opened in a silent scream. It shattered. Blue shards rained down on the snow. Whites around it collapsed like cut marionettes. Men stared, chests heaving. Brandon, leading from the chest where the earlier blow had cracked something vital, felt the change. Not only in the air, but in the roots underfoot. A new presence, bright and fierce, had joined the old. The scar thickened. The red shimmer in the sky steadied. Liana, he thought, and sobbed with something like joy. He did not have long to feel it. His heart, already cracked, gave one last slow, stubborn beat. He felt it falter. He felt his body begin to fall. As he fell, he reached. He had spent decades reaching toward the roots in his dreams. Now he reached in his dying, not for a place among the buried kings. He was too old, too worn, too tangled in flesh for that. But for one last touch, he brushed his daughter. Liana felt him like a warm hand in winter. For a moment, their minds touched. The old king and the new-rooted queen, human and more than. Sorry, he thought, or said or pushed at her. Not with words, but with the echo of his voice. Should have let you decide sooner. Stubborn old wolf, she replied with the feel of a laugh and a sob in one. Rest, father. I've got it. He smiled as he died. On the field, Arto's the younger caught his father's body before it hit the ground. He knelt, cradling the old man's head in his arms, snow and blood staining his knees. For an instant, the world narrowed to that. The still face, the white beard, the lines carved by years of winter and worry. Brandon Stark, second of that name since the wall fell, King of Winter, who had held his people between cold and death for so long that he had almost forgotten any other life, was suddenly only a man again. A man who was loved. Father, Artos whispered. His breath smoked in the air. Father, wake. Brandon did not. The dead did. They surged again, as if sensing the moment of human grief. But this time, when they pressed at the barrier, they found something new. Liana. She did not hold the scar the way Artos had. He had been a wall of stubborn stone, unyielding, taking the blows, grinding himself down. She was something else. She was willow and ash, bending, flowing, turning their cold aside. She learned quickly. Every time another focused its will on a particular crack, she twisted the roots there, thickening them, weaving their cold back on itself. She learned to feel the patterns in their assault, the slow pulse of their hunger. She slid her awareness from weirwood to weirwood like a girl running through a familiar wood, using each as a lantern in the dark. The war did not end that winter. The dead did not give up and go home. They had no home. The tide of whites ebbed and flowed for years, sometimes surging as if to drown the north, sometimes withdrawing to lick its frozen wounds. Small houses fell in rows. Children were born who had never seen green leaves. Old men died who remembered summers when the sun had felt warm on their faces. Ardos the Younger became king almost without noticing. He had no time to grieve properly. The ravens brought word of new crises every day. A holdfast in the Barrow lands where the dead attacked from beneath the ground. Skeletons bursting from old graves. A village on the stony shore where men had taken to burning their own sick before the dead could claim them. A Bolton lord, rosy as grandson, pale and sharp as his forebears, who was rumored to be experimenting with his own corpses, trying to bind them. Ardos rode, judged, ordered, burned, buried, planted. He was not the king his grandfather had been, nor the Greenseer his aunt was. He was something in between. He held together the lines of men while she held together the lines of roots. They did not speak often. Her voice in the roots was a constant pressure in the back of his skull, like a second heartbeat. But when they did, it was as brother and sister, arguing over how best to save a world that seemed determined to die. "You cannot spare that many men for the South," Lyanna would say, her voice rustling in the leaves of his dreams. "If the neck falls, the cold will pour into the riverlands and beyond. The barrier won't reach far enough." "If I don't shore up White Harbor," Ardos would reply, staring at his maps, "we'll starve. Frozen corpses don't march very far if there's nothing for them to eat on the way." "They don't need to eat," she would say. "I meant us," he would answer. They fought, and they held. The long withholding lasted 3 generations. Children were born beneath the red leaves to the music of distant battle. They learned their letters tracing the carved tears on Hearttree's faces. They measured time not in summers and winters, but in the distance to the last major push of the dead. Lyanna Stark lay in the roots and felt every one of their lives them as faint flickers in the patterns of Sapat Dada. She learned each family's stories, the Umbers who still swore louder than anyone despite their dwindling numbers, the Reeds who fed drowned whites to their fish and then ate the fish and called it a kind of revenge, the Manderless who built entire ships of frozen timber and sailed them along the White Knife to ferry refugees. She also felt every death. She had thought, when she bound herself, that the pain of flesh opening to roots would be the worst she would ever know. She was wrong. The worst pain was staying. The dead had patience beyond human reckoning. They did not age. They did not tire. They marched, always somewhere at the edge of her perception, a low crunch of snow and a faint, cold song. Their leaders, the others, whose true names were a pattern of ice that had never known warmth, pressed at the barrier with eternal, tireless hands. Lyanna learned the shape of each of them. One was sharp and fast, like a crackling frost that spread too quickly over a pond. Another was slow and heavy, like packed snow on a roof, waiting to fall. A third was thin and piercing, a cold wind that found every gap under a cloak. She gave them names in her mind, though they did not care. Shar, Drift, Dot, Needle. Shard was the one who probed the deepest. He pushed where men forgot. When some petty northern lord, tired of winter and hearing nothing but endless stories of old sacrifices, cut down a heart tree to build a bigger hall or a stronger palisade, Shard felt the weakening. He pressed. Lyanna scrambled to send roots through other smaller trees, binding them together to cover the gap. But it took time she rarely had. Sometimes she reached in time. Sometimes an entire line of villages burned blue before she could thicken the scar. When that happened, she kept the names of the villages in her mind like seeds and whispered them to her wolves as they hunted. There were wolves. The packs had grown over the decades. Those who ate whites learned to taste the cold and avoid it. Those who laired in the Godswoods learned to listen to Lyanna. She saw through their eyes sometimes, when she could not bear the stillness of her rooted body. They ran through white forests, their paws silent on snow. They tore out the throats of men who had taken the blue fire into themselves. They howled at the others, and snapped at their pale horses' legs. They were not always victorious, but they were always fierce. The men of the north began to tell a new story. That sometimes when all hope was lost, when the whites were at the gate, and the fire had gone out, and the dragon glass had shattered, a great she-wolf with sap on her fur and red leaves in her pelt would leap from the shadows and tear the dead apart. They called her the Root Queen's bitch, though never where Stark might hear it. Artos the Younger died in his bed, an oddity in that age. He was old, his bones hollow with years of winter. His grandchildren gathered around him, small, serious faces framed by furs, eyes gray and blue and green. Remember the stories, he told them. Not the songs, the stories. Songs make things pretty. Stories make them true. Remember why your bones are cold. Because the dead don't tire, one granddaughter said solemnly. Because winter is coming, another murmured. He smiled faintly. Because we chose to live here, he said. Men could have run. South. Across the sea. Into caves. We could have left the north empty. A feast for the dead. But we didn't. We stayed. We dug in our heels. We bound ourselves to the roots. Remember that choice. Make it again, every day. Me. They promised they would, like children promised many things. Some of them kept their promises. There came a day, 3 generations after the wall's fall, when the dead slowed. It took Lyanna some time to believe it. At first, she thought she was only growing numb. Too many years in the roots, too many winters, too many pushes. But the patterns were different. The blue song that had been a constant pressure in the back of her mind faded, a fraction. The cold where shard and drift and needle had been pressing retreated, ever so slightly. The whites still moved, but their movements were aimless, scattered, as if some central will had turned away. She stretched her awareness as far north as she could. The lands of always winter were still a white mystery. Even rooted, she could not walk there easily. The ice was too old, the cold too deep, the stones too strangers. Still, she felt something, a crack. Not in the barrier this time, but in the cold beyond. As if some great engine had shifted, gears grinding and grown still. As if a heart of ice had skipped a beat. Father, she whispered in the roots. Grandfather. Ardos's presence was faint now, his thoughts slow and wide as rivers. He had long since stopped speaking in anything like words. But she felt, in him, a sense of, and grief, and release. He was letting go. He had held the scar for nearly a century, longer than any rooted mind should have. Lyanna had been with him for half that time. Together, they had woven a barrier that was less a wall than a web, roots tying together every sacred place in the north. It had held. Now, perhaps it did not need to hold so hard. Sleep, she whispered to him. You've done enough. He did. The old king of winter's mind unraveled slowly in her arms, like an old cloak worn to threads. She wrapped his last thoughts in her own. Wolves in snow, children under leaves, the sound of ravens' wings. Then, he was gone. The cold beyond the scar did not surge in. It lingered, restless, then drifted back, like a tide reluctant to leave a favored shore. The dead did not vanish. They did not collapse on the spot. They were never that simple. Their bodies walked wherever the others had left them. Their hands clawed and tore. But their numbers no longer swelled. No new blue fires kindled in dead eyes. The ancient will that had driven them like a whip had turned its gaze elsewhere, or been broken, or grown bored. She could not tell which. The long withholding began to ease. Snow still fell, but sometimes it melted for a few days in the brief, fragile summers. Children saw green leaves for the first time in their lives, and laughed until their faces hurt. Farmers planted cautious rows of hardy barley, and wept when something sprouted. The Starks did not stand their men down. Winter doesn't end in a day. Lyanna said through the trees to her grandnephew, the new king. Or a year, or a lifetime. It ends and comes and ends again. The dead may rise in another 1,000 years, when we are stories and our stories have grown soft. You must not let your children forget what the roots remember. How? He asked. He was young, as kings went, with a scar across his nose from a white's broken tooth and eyes, the color of storm skies. Keep telling the stories, she said. Keep kneeling under the trees. Keep giving them blood when they ask. Keep listening to the wolves. Keep a Stark in Winterfell. Keep a Stark in the roots when my time ends. She smiled, a feeling like wind in leaves. Make sure they're stubborn. The roots like stubborn. He laughed, an old, hard sound for a young man. Stubborn we have, he said. Fear we have. Love we have. Songs we have. He looked up at the heart tree's face in the godswood. Do we still need kings? The question surprised her. She thought of Ardos, half buried in the roots, giving up his sight and his sword for a barrier like a scar. She thought of Brandon dying on the snow with his daughter's voice in his ears. She thought of herself, stretched thin between roots and dreams, holding back a cold that did not understand mercy. Not the way we were, she said slowly. Not kings above and beyond, kings beside and beneath perhaps, kings who kneel as much as they sit. She felt the roots shift around her, the old gods listening with their endless, inhuman patience. The North made us kings once because we promised to stand between them and the dark. That promise still stands. Call it what you will. King.e. Lord. Warden. Rooted fool. Just don't forget why the promise was made. Nah, we won't, he said with a young man's certainty. She wished she could believe him without doubt. But she felt, even as the cold receded, the first faint whisper of forgetfulness. In 100 years, they would speak of the long withholding with awe. In 200, with pride. In 3, with weary boredom when old men told tales. In 4, some clever child would suggest cutting down a heart tree because its roots were undermining a wall. The roots would remember. The North, too, in its bones. There would always be winters. There would always be dead. Men would always walk the knife edge between sacrifice and comfort, between memory and forgetting. But there had been once a time when the wall fell a century early, and the old Stark kings fought an ancient winter not in one doomed blaze, but in a long, stubborn simmer. They burned their dead. They bled for their trees. They lay down in the roots and became scars in the world. For generations thereafter, when snow drifted high against Winterfell's walls, and the wind howled down from the broken north, children would huddle by the fire and whisper another set of words, not as well known as those carved beneath the dire wolf on the Stark's gray banner, but no less true. There must always be a Stark in the roots, they would say. And under the red leaves, where the sap ran slow and deep and tasted of blood and memory, the old kings of winter listened and held and waited for the day men needed them to rise again. Okay. Generations later, the threat returned not as a screaming wall of ice, but as a slow, quiet forgetting. Boys and girls in Winterfell's yard swung wooden swords at one another beneath a pale, thin sky, their breath puffing in the chill. They learned their letters scratching names into the packed snow with broken twigs. Brandon, Artos, Lyanna. The dead were stories to them, as dragons were stories to the Southerners. Grim, thrilling tales told by firelight, full of pale riders and brave kings who bound themselves into trees. No one in that yard had ever seen a white walker with their own eyes. Very few had seen a white that did not lie safely dead again at their feet. The long withholding was receding into song. Jonel Stark, King of Winter, watched his children spar from the gallery above the yard. His gloved hands curled over the frost-rimed stone. He was not old, not by the measure of Starks who had lived through worse winters. He had seen 35 name days, his dark hair just beginning to silver at the temples. His face was more like his grandmother's than his father's, angular and sharp, with eyes that missed little. The cold had carved itself into him without hollowing him yet. Below, his eldest son, Robar, 15 and tall for his age, feinted with a wooden sword and nearly knocked his younger sister off her feet. The girl rolled, snow flying around her in a dream of white, then sprang up with a feral grin and crashed into her brother again, driving him back step by step. "Easy, Layara," John'l called. His daughter laughed without looking up. "He's slower than the old hound's father." Robar huffed, cheeks reddened. "I slipped," he protested. "You always slip when you stop watching my hands," his sister said. She darted in and rapped his knuckles. "You see my shoulders and my eyes, not the blade." "Again," John'l said, though the maester at his side murmured something about chilblains and bruises. The maester's name was Tommen. He had come from Old Town some years past, with a chain bright with new links and a mind full of skepticism. The North fascinated and offended him in equal measure. He took copious notes on weirwoods and wolves, and watched the godswood with the wary curiosity of a man who found religion a useful madness for others. "They're too rough with each other," Tommen said now, pulling his cloak tighter. The southern cut wool did not hold the cold as northern furs did. "Your grace, a broken bone in such weather." "Mends," John'l said, "and learns. Let them be." He watched Liara slip under her brother's guard and jab at his unprotected ribs. Robar grunted and staggered, then laughed as he recovered his balance and lunged back. "They'll need to be rougher than that if the old songs ever stop being songs." Tommen sniffed lightly. "The long withholding has ended, Your Grace. Even Maester Harlan's oldest accounts agree. The last major incursion of whites was, what, nearly 20 years ago? A full generation, you have made peace with winter. Perhaps you might let your children know peace with one another as well." John'l's gaze stayed on his children. "Peace is asleep," he said quietly. "Sleep is when men forget to keep watch." Tommen was silent for a moment. "You spoke with her again the past night," he said, curious, not quite respectful. "With the Root Queen, the Lady Lyanna." John'l's jaw tightened just a fraction. "Yes. And she still feels the others pressing at this scar in the world, as your grandsire described it?" Tommen asked, trying to make the words sound clinical, as if he were discussing a boil on a patient's neck. John'l heard the doubt under his tone. "Less than before," he said. "Fainter, like a blade left in a sheath. But yes, they have not gone. They are only waiting." "Perhaps what she feels is only the memory of their presence," Tommen suggested delicately. "If a man has been wounded badly, he will feel pain in the scar long after the flesh has knit. He aches when the weather turns, though there is no spear in him any longer. The mind remembers. So I suppose, roots." John'l finally looked at him. "You think she is an old scar, throbbing without cause?" "I think," Tommen said, spreading his hands, "that the North has bound itself to a story for so long that it cannot imagine living without the weight of it. Your people feed trees their blood and lay their kings down in the dirt because their grandfathers did the same. That does not mean the dead still march. It means you remember that they once did." "Nay. And if we stopped?" John'l asked. "If we cut down every heart tree and forgot every song?" Tommen smiled the thin, sad smile of a man sure of his truths. "Then perhaps you would finally step out of the long night and into the same dawn as the rest of the realm." John'l looked back down at his children. Lyra had taken a wooden sword to the thigh. She gritted her teeth and drove forward anyway, her blow ringing off Robar's parry. He could see the pain in the tight set of her jaw, but she did not ask to stop. "Or perhaps," he said, "we would wake to find the dawn was never ours to share." That night, he went to the Godswood. Winterfell's Godswood had always been a place of quiet bones. The centuries pressed close here, sunk into the roots and the stones and the black mirror of the pool. Snow lay deep between the trees, and the weirwood at its heart rose like a pale giant, its carved face bleeding frozen sap. John'll knelt before it. His breath was a slow ghost. His hand on the white trunk looked small, even in its glove. "Lyanna," he whispered. "My aunt, my queen, are you listening?" He did not close his eyes at once. He had done so too often as a boy, full of eager curiosity. The dreams that came then had been wild and vivid. Wolves and ravens, roots wrapping his ankles, voices murmuring in languages older than the first men. He knew better now than to invite them lightly. The stillness of the godswood shifted. It was subtle. The faintest rustle of leaves, though no wind stirred. The quiet change in the pitch of silence. John'll let out the breath he'd been holding and finally shut his eyes. Red seeped into the darkness behind his lids. He stood, barefoot and bare-armed in a familiar grove. The heart trees clustered around him like watchers, their faces solemn. The great central weirwood loomed, its bark slick with sap. Lyanna Stark sat at its roots. "John'll," she said, and smiled. She was not as he remembered her from the one half-faded painting that still hung in the Winterfell hall. A young woman with black hair and fierce eyes and a crooked grin. Here she looked like herself as the roots knew her. Ageless and old at once, her hair tangled with leaves, her eyes white and blind and full of color at the same time. Roots climbed her legs and coiled around her torso, slipped into the crooks of her elbows and the soft hollow of her throat. Sap glistened at the corners of her eyes like tears. He had watched that slow transformation in his dreams since he was a child. It no longer startled him. It only made his chest ache. He said, bowing his head. "Have you been scolding the maester again?" she asked. Her voice was a dry rustle, like wind in winter leaves. "I felt your hackles up earlier," John'll huffed. "He thinks you are a lingering ache." He lifted his gaze. "He thinks we have bound ourselves to an old fear." "We have," Lyanna said. "It is better than binding ourselves to a new one." "He says the whites have not come in strength for a generation," John'll said. "He keeps careful ledgers. 2 whites at Queen's Crown 4 years past. 9 at the last river ford 12 years ago. All burned. All contained. He says if the others still pressed, we would see more." "By day. No 3. Lyanna's blind eyes turned inward. He knew she was listening, to the roots, to the stones, to the faint, cold hum beyond. "They press less," she acknowledged. "Some awoke fully when the wall fell. Those were the ones who marched, who tested the scar your grandfather carved into the world. Some remained half dreaming in the deep cold. Those have never fully woken, not in all my years here. But they stir now and again. They turn in their sleep. They dream of us. None guts the eye. And if they wake?" John'll asked. She smiled wryly. "Then you'll be glad you kept the trees." He paced along the line of roots, the bark cold under his bare feet. The dream always stripped him down. The roots did not like steel or leather between them and skin. "Tommen says the South has seen none of this," he muttered. "No whites in their fields, no mists that won't burn off, no horses found stiff and white in their stalls come morning. They call the long night a fable now. Something the Starks tell to justify their stubbornness." "Nay, then, you." "Southrons always thought winter was a story," Lyanna said. "Even when they were freezing to death in their towers. They have shorter memories, less need of them. Summer comes sooner for them, so they forget faster. Let them." Her voice softened. "We remember for them. That was Ardos's bargain. He chose that bargain for us," John'll said sharply. "We have not chosen it ourselves in generations. I wonder if any of us truly would, if you came to us as you went to him. If you stood in my hall now and said, 'I will lie down in the roots and let them eat me. Who will join me?' How many would step forward?" "No." She tilted her head, listening to more than his words. "Fewer," she said. Every decade that passes without the dead beating at your gates is another decade men forget how much they feared them. Then, perhaps, Jonel said slowly, we should loosen the bargain a little. Enough to let my people breathe as something other than sentries. Lyanna's fingers stilled on the roots. What do you mean? She asked. There was no anger in her tone yet, only a wary curiosity. I mean, Jonel said, forcing himself to meet her blind gaze, that we feed the gods wood like a wound that never quite heals. Blood every full moon. Sacrifices at midwinter. We send condemned men to the trees instead of the headsmen. Our people live with the knowledge that if they anger the wrong men, they might end their days buried up to their lips in roots. They do not, Lyanna said quietly. We stopped that 2 generations ago. Your grandmother did. Your father never flayed a man on a heart tree. Do not make me harsher than we are. Nai? You still take volunteers, Jonel said. Yes. Her answer was simple. And one day, he said, you will need more than volunteers. Another of stark blood. Another root king, or queen, to stand with you when your own mind begins to fray. I can feel you thinning, Lyanna. You can't deny it. You can't deny it. Her hand lifted, roots shifting with it like cumbersome jewelry. She touched his cheek. Honesty becomes you, she said. Yes, I am not what I was. Holding the scar has cost me. I could go on like this for 50 years more. Perhaps 100, if the dead continue to sleep. But it would not be safe to leave it so. At some point, you will need to give me another. A son, a daughter, a niece. Jonel's throat tightened. Someone who trusts me, who loves me, who will go where I send them. Not where you send them, Lyanna said. Where they choose to go. If they are to hold the scar, they must walk into the roots on their own feet. And if they don't, Jonel asked. Then winter comes again, she said. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, the god's wood was only trees again. The heart tree's face wept slowly. Snow ticked on his cloak. He rose stiffly, his knees protesting the cold. As he turned to go, he saw a small shape sitting on the low stone wall near the pool, knees drawn to her chest. Liara. She hugged her arms around herself, her breath a faint ghost in the air. Her dark hair was unbound, a spill over her shoulders. Snowflakes clung to it. How long have you been there? He asked. She swung her legs down. Long enough, she said. You talk in your sleep. I wasn't sleeping, he said. In your god's sleep, she corrected, with a crooked little smile that was all Winterfell. We'll have to find another word for it someday. Sleep isn't quite right. He sighed and walked to her side. She was almost as tall as his shoulder now. When had that happened? He remembered her as a little girl chasing pups down the corridors, her bare feet slapping stone. What did you hear? He asked. Enough, she said. The maester thinks Aunt Lyanna is a scar. You think she's a chain? She thinks she's a gate. Liara shrugged. She's not wrong. You hear her more than Roba does, he said. Thantorin. Then your cousins? You always have. It's loud. Liara muttered. Some nights I can't sleep for all the roots telling me about moles in the walls and beetles under the bark. She wrinkled her nose. Trees think about strange things. Does it frighten you? He asked. No, she said at once, then hesitated. Sometimes, not the voices, the thought of them going quiet. Like the dead would all hold their breath at once. She glanced up at the heart tree. What will you do? About what? About Aunt Lyanna, Liara said. About the next one in the roots. He looked at her. She was still young. 14 barely. Too old to be a child. Too young to be sacrificed in any story a sane man would write. I will do nothing, he said. For now, we have time. And when we don't? She asked softly. He did not answer. The first sign that time was shorter than he thought came 2 winters later, in a village on the furthest flung edge of the rills. It was the sort of place even northern maps forgot. A cluster of low stone houses crouched beside a half-frozen stream. A little square where men sharpened tools and women traded gossip. A tumble-down sept the villagers had built themselves when a wandering septim came through 40 years ago and convinced them 7 were safer than 1. The septon had died of the flux 20 years past. No one had come to replace him. The 7's carved faces over the altar were cracked and moss-streaked. Men still went to the weirwood at the edge of the village on cold nights to mutter hedge prayers they barely remembered. They had stopped bleeding the tree years ago. "Waste of good blood," one farmer had grumbled, as winter bit his cattle and his children's cheeks. "They say the long withholding's over. My grandsire saw White Walkers. I have not. My son will not. Why should we feed stories when our bellies are empty?" So the weirwood's roots drank only snowmelt and the occasional spilled ale. Its red leaves rattled in the wind, feeling thin. One night, a mist rolled in. It came with no wind. One moment the stars were bright above, and the next they were gone, swallowed by a white shroud. The air grew silent. The stream stilled, the ice on its surface shining milk pale. A dog barked once sharply, then whined and crawled under its master's bed. Old Nella, who had lived through 3 long winters and remembered when King Ardos himself had ridden through with a host behind him, sat up on her pallet, her bones aching with a cold that was not in the air. She knew this feeling. She had hoped never to feel it again. She pulled on her boots and shawl with stiff fingers and stepped out into the night. The mist curled around her ankles like a living thing. It tasted of old stone and deeper things. She limped toward the weirwood, leaning on her stick. "Old man," she muttered, though the heart tree's face was that of a young woman, carved by some long-dead hand. "You'd better wake. They're coming." The weirwood did not answer. Its face was slack, its carved eyes weeping sap slowly. Its leaves hung limp. The cold pressed against its bark without resistance. In the roots, Lyanna felt it at once. It was a prickling weakness, a draft under a door long sealed. She sent her awareness skimming along the network of roots, through the deep bars of old weirwoods, and the thin, twisty fingers of younger ones. She found the gap near the rills and pushed sap into it, thickening what roots she could. The weirwood there shivered faintly. A few red leaves lifted, as if feeling a breath. Lyanna reached further, looking for the memory of blood. She found none. No sacrifices for 8 years. No kings kneeling. No condemned men hung from branches. Only a few children had climbed the tree in summer, their bare feet scratching its bark as they played. One had carved her initials into it with a stolen knife. The roots remembered the sting and the laughter and the blood that had welled from her small cut finger. Lyanna grasped that tiny thread of blood memory and pulled hard. In the village, old Nella wheezed and clutched at her chest. The cold in the air thickened, but the cold underfoot eased a little. The mist slowed. The dead still came. They walked at the edge of the village like ghosts in a dream. Whites that had once been men of the rills long dead and buried, called up from sodden graves. Whites that had been wildlings, their fur and leather crusted with ice. 1 or 2 thin shapes on pale horses, blue eyes bright gaunt. They could not push as hard through the weirwood's thyning roots as they might have. Lyanna held, teeth gritted, feeling the strain like hands tearing at her hair. She sent wolves where she could, snapping and snarling in the mist, their eyes full of her red leaf thoughts. It was not enough. 5 houses burned that night. 15 villagers died screaming. Old Nella lived long enough to see the first white set alight with a pan of spilled tallow in a trembling hand. She died on her knees before the weirwood, hands red with the blood she had spilled from her own arm onto its roots. She died angry. Lyanna drank that anger like strong ale. She poured it into the roots, closing the gap inch by inch. By dawn, the dead had broken themselves against the thin barrier and begun to wander away, seeking easier walls. By dawn, Lyanna was shaking. In the Winterfell godswood, the heart tree's red leaves thrashed, though no wind stirred. Its roots writhed beneath the soil like snakes in a sack. Jonel woke with a start, his heart pounding. He had dreamed of a village burning, of an old woman swearing at him as she died. He pulled on his furs with clumsy haste and ran barefoot to the godswood, heedless of maids' startled cries as he passed. The air in the wood hummed. Snow clung to the branches in peculiar patterns, as if flung there by frantic hands. The heart tree was streaming sap, its carved eyes weeping in steady rivulets. He pressed his palm to the bark. "Lyanna," he whispered. "What happened?" The answer came not as a voice, but as a flood. Smoke and screams. The feel of cold pressing through thin roots. The sense of a gap, of an absence where there should have been blood and memory. "We did what we could," came her thought, strained and ragged. A village, half gone. We held in time. We almost didn't. Jonel closed his eyes, jaw clenched. "Where?" he forced out. She showed him, a smear of impression, a hint of the rills, a stream cutting through low hills, a small, stubborn weirwood at the edge of fields. He stood with his hand on the tree until the shaking in the roots subsided and Lyanna's presence steadied again. Then he called for his steward. "Send riders to the rills," he said. "Tell Lord Risewell that if he does not bleed his trees and his people both before the next moon, I will do it for him. And send a raven to the citadel. Ask Maester Tommen to draft it. I want them to know that the dead still walk, that our roots held them out by inches." "Your Grace," the steward said cautiously, "if word spreads that the dead have risen again?" "Good," Jonel said. "Fear is a better watchman than comfort." The raven flew. It reached Old Town tired and ice-crusted, its wings heavy with the long journey's frost. Maesters in warm gray robes clucked and fussed and thawed it by the fire. They took the message from its leg, read the crabbed northern script, and shook their heads. "The Starks and their winter tales," one said, dipping his bread in honey. "They never tire of frightening themselves." "Perhaps they have reason," another suggested weakly. "The long night is 8,000 years past," the first scoffed. "We have better records now. We would know if anything even half so dreadful returned." "They say it did," the second persisted. "In the long withholding, less than a century ago. There are accounts. Ravaged villages. The fall of the wall. Accounts from men who see omens in every snowfall," the first said. "The North delights in horror. It proves their point, that they are hardier than the rest of us. If we tell them there are no more monsters, they will invent some to justify keeping their children swinging swords instead of learning their sums." They laughed. The letter was filed away in the Citadel's vast, indifferent belly, another scrap of parchment in a room of too many. In Winterfell, Jonel sat in the hall before the fire and thought of cutting his maester's chain off link by link and sending him to the wall that was to see the ruins for himself. He did not, of course. Southrons were useful, even when they did not listen. They knew things about herbs and sailing, about numbers and diseases. They knew how to build better mills, and how to treat rot in a horse's hoof, and how to brew stronger moon tea. They were not to be thrown away like broken spears. But the forgetting was spreading faster than the cold now. He saw it in small ways. A lord who decided to expand his hall and took down the little heart tree that had grown too close, saying, "We have 3 more. What difference will one make?" A father who told his son not to bother learning the old songs, only the new ones about kings who fought men, not shadows. A Bolton cousin who came to Winterfell wearing a 7-pointed star pinned to his cloak. The lines of the flayed man on his banner softened as if he were ashamed of it. "We must move with the times," that cousin had said, sipping wine by Jonel's fire. "The North cannot stand apart forever. The South grows rich while we burn our own dead for fear of them walking. Let the past be past, cousin. Let your roots go to sleep." "You speak of my roots as if they were mine alone," Jonel had said. You forget you live on them." The cousin had only shrugged and asked for more wine. When the next winter deepened, Lyanna's weariness grew. John'l felt it whenever he knelt beneath the heart tree. Her thoughts were slower, as if moving through thicker sap. Sometimes she lost words. Sometimes she repeated herself. "Have I told you?" she asked him once, smiling. "About the first time I hid in the kitchens to steal a meat pie?" "Yes," he said softly. "You scared the cook so badly she dropped the tray. He chased me through the yard with a ladle," she said, laughing. He had flour on his face like war paint. The laughter faded. "That was summer. Real summer. I remember. Green." Her voice went quiet. "I would like to see green again." "You see it through the trees," he said. "It's not the same," she murmured. "Seeing it and touching it. I remember lying in the grass and feeling the sun on my arms. I did not think then that I would miss feeling my own skin." Her blind eyes turned toward him. "Don't come to me unless you need me, John'l. Go lie in the grass. Remember for me." He swallowed around a tightness in his throat. "We will find another," he said. "Someone else to sit with you. Take the weight. Let you rest." She tilted her head. "Will you?" He thought of Liara, sitting on the godswood wall with snow in her hair, asking what he would do. "Yes," he said. "We must." The decision was made for him sooner than he would have liked. The winter's worst storm came on a night when the sky had been clear at sunset. The stars blinked out one by one, as if someone had pinched their lights between gloved fingers. The wind swung north in a single breath, bringing with it a cold that bit through stone. Snow drove sideways, slamming against Winterfell's walls hard enough to make the old gray stones creak. In the godswood, the heart tree thrashed. John'l felt the shock like a bang in his skull. He staggered in the corridor outside his chambers, his hand clutching the wall, and saw red for an instant. His children shouted, voices muffled by the sudden roar. "Father!" Robar grabbed his arm. "What?" "The roots," John'l grated out. "The scar. Some things." He forced himself upright. "Stay in the hall. Bar the doors." He shook off his son's hand and ran. The godswood was a frenzy. Snow whirled in wild circles, defying the wind. The branches of the heart tree whipped back and forth, cracking against one another. Sap flew, red droplets flecking the snow like scattered blood. John'l threw himself at the trunk, hands spread, breath tearing in his chest. "Lyanna!" The answer was a scream. Not in his ears. In his bones. In the roots under his feet. Cold slammed into him. He saw, not with his own eyes but with hers, a fissure in the scar that ran across the world. A crack that had crept outward slowly, day by day, under the pressure of something vast. Tonight, a shard had broken away. Shard. She had named him that long ago, the other whose will was sharp and fast. He had found a weak place where men had stopped tending their trees entirely, where a lord in his arrogance had cut down a grove to make room for a new sept, wanting to impress a southern bride with his piety. Through that place, the cold poured. Wights rose by the hundreds, clawing their way out of barrows. Pale horses galloped out of mists. Shard himself slid through the gap like a knife, his presence a blade of pure winter. Lyanna threw herself against him. John'l felt the impact reverberate through his skull. For a heartbeat, the other's cold touched him, and he saw flashes of a world drowned in snow. A forest of dead trees made of ice, their branches tinkling in a wind that never stopped. A sea frozen solid, whales of white crystal trapped beneath, their mouths open in silent songs. A sky where the sun was a pale smear behind clouds, unable to pierce the cold. Men frozen where they stood, their tears and snot and blood turned to tiny daggers on their faces. The cold was not cruel. It simply was. It did not hate. It only did not care. Lyanna's memory slammed back, hot and fierce. Children laughing under red leaves. wolves sleeping with their heads pillowed on human thighs, the taste of fresh bread in a warm kitchen, her father's hand on her hair. The first time she'd kissed a boy behind the stables and smelled sweat and horse and straw and thought, I am alive. She pushed. For centuries the scar had held. For decades she had kept it stitched together with roots and blood. Tonight, under the weight of Shard's sudden, slamming will and the accumulated strain of too many winters, it cracked. He drove a spike of cold into it, seeking her mind. Jonel felt the spike hit. Lyanna shrieked. Even bound in roots, even stretched through 1,000 weirwoods, she was still human enough for pain. She bent. She did not break. Not entirely. She flung her awareness along every root she owned, searching for something to brace herself against. She found old, deep weirwoods that had stood since before the wall, their memories thick and slow. She found young saplings planted in the last decade by children at their father's insistence, their minds bright and curious. She found wolves huddled under trees and lent them her strength. She found men in holds who still remembered to bleed their trees and took more blood than they meant to give. She found at last the thread she had been avoiding grasping. Liara. The girl was in her bed, blankets pulled over her head, trying to pretend she wasn't listening. The root beneath the stones of Winterfell's foundation pulsed gently under her palate, like a hidden vein. Lyanna grabbed it. Liara bolted upright, gasping. The world turned red. She saw the crack in the scar, saw Shard pushing through, his icy will like a white spear. She saw Lyanna's mind stretched to tearing, veins of sap fracturing under pressure. She saw for an instant every rooted Stark before her. Artos, half tree, his eyes clouded but stubborn. Brandon, not properly rooted but clinging to the edge of the dream to reach his daughter in his dying. Faces upon faces, some she knew from stories, some that had been lost in the telling. She saw the village and the rills burning again. Old Nella's defiant eyes, the maesters in Old Town laughing over their honeyed bread, her father's face in the godswood shadowed and hard. She did not think. She threw herself into the roots. It was not the measured ritual binding that Lyanna had undergone, kneeling before the heart tree with a knife and an old seer's guidance. It was a girl leaping from a tower into a snowdrift because all her friends had dared her to. It was messy and wild and wrong. It was enough. The roots took her. They rushed up like a white tide, pale fingers grabbing her ankles, her wrists, her throat. They yanked her down through stone and dirt and memory. For an instant, she felt as if her body was being peeled from her bones. Then she was in the scar. It was a place without place, a line across the world that was also a space inside her own mind. She felt Lyanna there, a blazing knot of red and white and stubborn will, wrapped around a crack that glowed icy blue. Shard was on the other side of it, his presence sharp and bright, pushing. He felt her. He had no eyes, no face, no flesh, but his will turned toward her like a gaze. A flicker of surprise ran through the cold. Something new, the cold sang, in its own wordless way. Something green, something fierce. Liara had no training, no old songs, no idea what she was doing. She pushed anyway. She thought of her brothers, of Robar's blush when she beat him in the yard, of Torrent's quiet smile when he shared stolen sweets with her in the kitchens. She thought of the first time she had seen a white, only a single pitiful thing, dragging itself out of a ditch near Winterfell, its fingers falling off even as it reached for a frightened horse. She had been 7. She'd watched her father burn it, his face set and sad. She thought of lying on the castle roof, in the brief, rare summers, feeling the sun on her face, counting the fleecy clouds. She thought of the taste of snowflakes on her tongue. She thought of the way the roots whispered when she sat against the heart tree, stories curling in her ears like warm breath. "No," she told the cold. "You don't get that." She braided herself into Lyanna. Lyanna gasped. The spike of shards cold that had been driving into her mind suddenly had more wood to pierce. 2 bundles of roots instead of 1. 2 stubborn Starks instead of 1. They gripped hands, not literally, but in the way minds can, and pushed together. The crack did not seal. It did not need to. It only needed to narrow enough that Shard could not slip through entirely. He tried. For a moment, he forced the gap wider, his will slicing at them like a knife. Lyanna screamed. Liara sobbed. The barrier bent. Then something else happened. They were not alone in the roots. Others had been laid down over the centuries. Not Starks. The old seer had compromised there grudgingly when the weight grew too heavy, but men and women from other northern lines, those with the knack for dreams and the old songs. Karstarks with their sunbursts, Reeds with their gray-green eyes, Mormonts with bear claws tattooed on their arms. They had been dim embers under Lyanna's blazing light, their minds mostly quiet, lending strength without consciousness. Lyara's wild leap woke them. Her presence was bright and young and furious. It stirred memories in them, a long-buried indignation at the cold that had claimed their children and their parents. One by one, they surged toward the scar. Shard felt that too. He recoiled. Not in fear. That would have required more self than he possessed. But in something like caution. This was not a single opponent holding a narrow gate, as it had been with Ardos alone, or a slightly stronger gate with Lyanna. This was a knot of wills now, all tangled, all human, all burning. He knew how to press against stone until it cracked. He was less accustomed to pushing against living things that refused to break the way lifeless matter did. He withdrew, just enough. The spike of cold pulled back from Lyanna's mind. The crack in the scar stopped spreading. It did not close, but it stilled. The storm outside Winterfell's walls slackened. Snow still fell, thick and heavy, but the wind's edge dulled. The bone-deep cold eased a fraction. Men who had been shivering in their pallets rode it off as weather. Wolves lifted their heads in their dens, blinked, and settled. In the scar, Lyanna gasped like a woman who had nearly drowned. "Idiot girl," she croaked and laughed, half hysterical. "What did you do?" "Helped," Liara managed, her sense of self fraying at the edges. "You said you needed another. I was there." "You didn't even ask," Lyanna said. "Starks. We never ask." "I didn't have time." Liara's awareness flickered. She could feel her body somewhere above, in Winterfell's stones, her heart hammering, her lungs heaving. She could feel her father's hands on her shoulders, shaking her, shouting her name. "I think I'm half in and half out." "You are," Lyanna said. "You leapt. The roots caught you, but they haven't finished swallowing you." She sounded awed and exasperated and grateful. "You absolute fool." "I had a good example," Liara muttered. Lyanna's laughter threaded through the roots. "We'll make something of this," she said. "We'll have to. Help me hold." Liara took her hand again. Together with the other rooted minds rising around them like a choir, they pushed the cold back into its corner. Shard lingered at the edge of the scar, not retreating entirely, but no longer slamming. He seemed thoughtful. He would try again. They knew that, but not tonight. In the Godswood, Jonel held his daughter's shaking body in his arms. Her eyes had rolled back in her head. Her lips were blue with cold, though the heart tree's roots beneath the snow were warm now, pulsing with sap. Her hands were clawed, fingers digging into his sleeves. "Liara," he whispered. "Come back. Please, come back." Her breath rattled, then steadied. Her eyes flicked open. They were gray, as they had always been, for a moment. Then white filmed across them like frost. "Father," she said. Her voice was rough with disuse that did not belong to a 14-year-old girl. "I did something very stupid." He choked on a laugh that tasted of tears. "So I gathered. I jumped," she said, "into the roots, and Lyanna caught me." She winced. And others. There are so many. Her gaze lost focus, as if looking at something far away. I can feel the scar, the cold. It's loud. He hugged her tighter. Can you come out? She frowned, concentrating. After a moment, the white film in her eyes faded, returning to gray. Her breath grew shallower. Halfway, she said. I can still feel my feet. And my body. She flexed her fingers experimentally. But my self is stretched. She grimaced. It hurts. Can you stop? He asked hoarsely. Can you let go? She shook her head. If I do, the roots will take me all at once. I'll be gone, and Aunt Lyanna will fall. Her mouth twisted. I can't let go. Not completely. Not now. He closed his eyes. He remembered his talk with Lyanna in the Dream Grove, the promise to find another, the vow not to choose a child. He remembered saying, "We have time." The gods were laughing. What do we do? He asked. And the question was not for the old gods or the new or the dead or the citadel. It was for his daughter. She took a breath. You let me stay like this, she said. Half-rooted, half not. For as long as I can. I'll hold with her. I'll listen. I'll tell you where the cracks are thin. She swallowed. And you listen, Father. You make them bleed their trees. You make them plant new ones. You make them remember. You don't let them pretend this is over. And when you can't stay halfway? He asked quietly. Then you dig, she said. A nice deep hole for me, next to Aunt Lyanna. Some roots, some stones. You lay me down and let the rest of me go. She smiled, faint and fierce. Not yet, but you will. And I'll be waiting. On the other side. He pressed his forehead to hers. I'm sorry, he whispered. I should have. Chosen for me? She asked. Never. Her voice softened. You raised me. That's enough. In the days that followed, news came from the north. A minor holdfast of House Riswell, the one that had cut down its grove for a sept, had been wiped from the map. Riders sent to its ruins found only blue-black charcoal, frozen bones, and snow melted in strange, spiraling patterns, as if fire and frost had danced there together. The sept was gone. In its place, a sapling pushed up through the scorched earth. Its leaves were red, even in winter. Maester Tommen stood before it, his breath puffing white, his hands shaking as he reached out to touch its bark. It shouldn't be possible, he stammered. Wirewoods take centuries to. Some grow faster when they drink enough blood, Jonel said. His voice was flat. Write to the Citadel, Maester. Tell them that when northern lords cut down their godswoods, the dead come knocking. Tell them the roots remember. Tell them my daughter is learning their names. Tommen bowed his head. They won't listen, he said quietly. They never do. Then write it anyway, Jonel said. If nothing else, the roots will listen. They have longer memories than your brothers. Tommen wrote. The letter joined the other in the Citadel's archives, a warning amid dust. Most maesters never read it. One or two did and frowned thoughtfully, then were promoted to comfortable posts in the Reach where winter touched only lightly. Lyanna and Liara held. The years that followed were neither full peace nor open war. The dead tested the scar from time to time, like wolves nosing a fence they couldn't see but felt. Sometimes shard pressed, sometimes drift with slow, heavy weight, sometimes needle, seeking tiny gaps. Each time they met more than one mind at the gate now. Liara learned. Lyanna had had old seers and children of the forest to teach her at the beginning, men and women who remembered the first bindings of roots and blood. Liara had only Lyanna and the others in the network with their fragments of understanding. They pieced together what they could. You're too quick, Lyanna told her once, in a rare quiet moment. You leap to every flicker. I don't like leaving weak spots, Liara said. They itch. You can't cover everything at once, Lyanna said. "You'll wear yourself thin. Trust the others. Trust the roots. They hold more than you think." "No, aye. The others are slow," Lyanna grumbled. "They drift. They're older," Lyanna said. "They know the cost of leaping. You'll learn." Her voice softened. "You shouldn't have had to. You should be on a horse somewhere, swearing at the snow." "I can still swear at it," Liara said. "It just hears me better now." On the surface, in Winterfell and the scattered holds, life went on. Children were born and learned to walk on floors that had seen kings fall. Men married women and made bargains over bread and ale. Wolves died and new wolves were born. Heart trees grew, slowly, their roots twining deeper. Stories changed. The long withholding became something told not with terror, but with grim pride. Men boasted of grandfathers who had fought wights and kings who had bound themselves to trees. Children dared one another to touch the heart tree's bleeding faces and see if the old kings spoke to them. Liara spoke to them. She whispered in their dreams sometimes, when they slept with their backs against the white bark. She showed them flashes, a hand on a sword in a blizzard, a wolf's eyes, a girl standing in roots. She whispered, "Remember, remember, remember." Not all remembered upon waking. Dreams fade, but something of it stayed coiled in their bones. There came a day, many years later, when Liara's halfway place began to fail. She felt it first in her feet. She had grown used to the strange sensation of living in two places at once. Her body in Winterfell, her mind stretched through roots. She had learned to walk the yard with her brothers and sisters, to share bread at table, to sit through Lord's meetings with half her thoughts elsewhere. She moved carefully, like a woman balancing a heavy bowl. One morning in late autumn, she rose from her bed and stumbled. Her toes were numb. She flexed them and felt nothing. The floor underfoot might as well have been mist. She gritted her teeth and took a step. Then, another. By the time she reached the yard, her ankles were gone. She wobbled, nearly fell, caught herself on a post. "Liara." Robar caught her elbow. He was a man grown now, beard thick. Eyes lined with worry he tried to hide. "Are you ill?" "Just..." she said. "Go on. Show Torin that trick with the spear butt again. He keeps jabbing too high." "Nay. Nay. To me." She stood and watched them, her hand white-knuckled on the post as the numbness crept up her calves. That night, she went to the Godswood without calling her father. She knelt before the heart tree, her hands on its bark, and let her eyes roll back. The white film came easily now. Lyanna was waiting for her. "You feel it," Liara said, not bothering with greetings. "Yes," Lyanna said. "The roots are greedy. They want all of you." "I don't have much left," Liara said. "My legs are already gone." She flexed toes she could feel only in memory. "I can't run anymore. Not here." "You can run here," Lyanna said, in the scar. "As long as you like, through snow that doesn't bite, through leaves that never fall, through memories no one else keeps." "It's not the same," Liara said quietly. "I know. I heard you say so." Lyanna was quiet a long moment. "I won't lie to you," she said at last. "It isn't the same, but it's something, and someone has to sit with me when I'm too thin to sit myself. You've made yourself the only choice." Liara laughed, a short, breathless sound. "Starks," she said again. "We never ask." "You can still tell your father," Lyanna said. "He deserves a warning." "He already knows," Liara said. "He watches me walk. He hears me stumble in the night." She smiled sadly. "He doesn't say it because he wants to borrow a few more days where I can sit at his table and roll my eyes at him." "Let him have them," Lyanna said softly. "There's no honor in hurrying grief." They held the scar together for another year. Liara's numbness climbed past her knees, then her thighs. She stopped training in the yard. She sat in the hall by the fire instead, listening to her siblings speak, feeling the warmth on her face, and nowhere else. She ate less. Food tasted thin like echoes. She laughed when she could. She teased. She refused to let anyone carry her unless she was truly spent. One evening, as the first real snow of the season began to fall, she found her father alone in the yard, staring up at the flakes. "They're not white," he said as she came to stand beside him. "Not really. Not up close." She tipped her head back. The flakes drifted down, each one a tiny, intricate shape. "Little bits of sky," she murmured. He glanced at her. "You're going," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. "When?" His voice was hoarse. "When I can't feel my hands," she said. She flexed her fingers. Sensation still hummed there, faint but stubborn. "I want to hold yours at the end." He swallowed. "You'll hold it after," he said. From the other side, she bumped her shoulder against his. "I'll pull your hair in your dreams if you don't listen when I tell you to burn something." He choked on a laugh. "I'll tell the maester that when he complains about the smoke." They stood together in the falling snow until their hair and shoulders were dusted white. When the numbness finally crept into her fingertips, it was not in a storm or a battle or a night of dire omens. It was in the middle of an ordinary morning. She was sitting at table, listening to her younger cousins argue about whether wolves or bears were better in a fight. Her cup of ale between her hands. She went to lift it and realized she could not feel the wood. She looked down at her fingers. They were steady. They wrapped around the cup's curve as they always had. But there was no sense of warmth or roughness. No sense at all. "Father," she said quietly. Conversation around the table went on, unaware. John'l turned his head sharply. "Yes," he said. She held up her hands. "I can't feel," she said. "I think it's time." He looked at her fingers, then back at her face. The lines around his mouth deepened. "Finish your ale," he said. "We'll go together." She tried to drink. She managed 3 swallows before her throat closed. She set the cup down. The walk to the God's Wood felt both endless and too short. Each step was a decision. Her legs moved because she told them to, not because she could feel the floor. She clung to John'l's arm, not for balance, but for the comfort of his solid presence. The snow in the God's Wood lay deep and untouched. The heart tree waited, its carved face grave. John'l knelt with her this time. He pressed her hand to the bark, his own on top of hers. "Old gods," he said, voice low. "You've had your run of us. Be gentle with my girl." "They're not gentle," Lyanna said dryly from the roots. "But they're steady." Liara smiled. "Ready?" she asked her father. "No," he said honestly. "Me neither," she said. "Let's do it." He laughed brokenly. She let her eyes roll back, feeling the white film slide over them. The roots rose to meet her. This time there was no halfway. They seized her ankles, her calves, her thighs with familiar hunger. They sank into her flesh, threading bone and blood. She felt her body for the last time as a whole, the ache in her back from sitting too long, the flutter in her stomach where nerves danced, the thud of her heart. She felt her father's hands, calloused and warm, on her shoulders. She felt the roots reach her chest. She thought wildly of all the things she hadn't done. She had never kissed anyone, never ridden to war, never sailed beyond White Harbor, never seen Old Town's towers or Dorna's red sands or the Summer Isle's warm waves. She had never held a child of her own. She had held the scar. She clung to that. The roots broke through her ribs, wrapped around her heart, and squeezed. There was pain. Then, there was not. Her awareness snapped free of her flesh and lanced along the network like lightning. She rose through the weirwoods, through Winterfell's heart tree, through every red-leafed watcher across the north, and came to rest beside Lyanna at the scar. "Did it," she gasped. Lyanna laughed through tears. She no longer had lungs, but the sound was real enough. "You did," she said. "Welcome home, foolish girl." In the hall, Jonel held his daughter's body as it sagged. Her eyes were white and sightless. Her skin was cold. She looked, disturbingly, as if she might sit up at any moment and scold him for how red his nose was. He laid her gently on the Godswood's snowy ground, his hands trembling. There was work to do. The hole had been dug days ago, when they knew this was coming. The roots had been laid ready. Men stood nearby with shovels, faces grim. "Give us a moment," Jonel said. They withdrew, leaving him alone with his child and the tree. He pressed his forehead to hers. "I will remember," he whispered. "I will make them remember. I swear it. There will always be a Stark in Winterfell. There will always be a Stark in the Roots. We will not leave you alone." In the scar, Lyanna heard him. "See," she told Lyanna, as they sat together in the strange, endless knot space that ran along the world's wound. He chose in the end. "Starks," Lyanna said, her blind eyes bright with something like pride. "We never ask, but we always answer." The years flowed. They do, whether watched by Roots or not. The cold that had pressed so hard in Ardos's and Brandon's and Lyanna's early days never quite returned to that fever pitch. Shard lingered, testing now and again, but he seemed to sense there were more minds at the scar now than he could easily overwhelm. Drift's slow weight pressed here and there, but the barrier had learned to bend. Needles sought cracks, but found them fewer. Men still died. Villages still burned now and then. The North still bled for its stubbornness. But children born in the centuries after Liara's binding did not know what it meant to see an army of whites marching across the fields. They grew up under skies that, while pale, sometimes showed blue. They ate bread more years than they chewed boiled leather. They learned sums and letters as well as sword and axe. The South continued to forget. Kings in the South fought other kings over chairs made of swords. Dragons came and went. Septons preached of seven-faced gods, and knights rode in bright armor and jousted for ladies' love. Maesters wrote careful histories that gave a chapter to the long night, and a page to the long withholding, and a line, perhaps, to rumors that the North still whispered to trees. The North did more than whisper. It knelt. Every generation, in Winterfell's Godswood and in smaller groves across the North, men and women bent knees before heart trees and spilled blood. Some of it was volunteer, some was penance, some was a king's own, given in thanks or fear. They pressed their palms to bark and listened. Sometimes, if they were very still and very stubborn, they heard a voice. Old, young, both. "We remember," the voices would say. "Remember with us." And if the child under the tree was a Stark, or had Starks in their line, sometimes the voice said, "Wake up," and tugged them gently into dreams filled with roots. There were other wars in time. Not all enemies marched with blue eyes. Men from the South moved north, seeking land and lumber as summers lengthened. Some brought septons with them. They made little stone temples and said the trees were only trees. They cut down saplings that grew too close to their walls. They built on old barrows without asking the roots below. Liara and Lyanna watched. Sometimes they sent wolves to remind such men that the forest was not empty. Sometimes they whispered in Northern King's dreams, saying, "That holdfast. There. It has forgotten." Sometimes they did nothing, letting the consequences teach. The roots ran deep. They bound the North not merely against the dead, but to itself. Men who knelt under heart trees in the Shadow Tower's rebuilt yard felt the same faint hum as those who knelt on Bear Island's shores. A sworn sword from White Harbor who married a girl from Last Hearth and moved to her hall found the trees there had the same stories in their sap as the ones he'd left. The North was disparate, quarrelsome, full of hard men with long grudges. The roots beneath their feet hummed with a unity they never quite admitted. On certain nights, when the wind was just so, and the auroras danced pale green over the broken line where the wall had once stood, children swore they saw shapes moving in the heart trees' faces. Not the carved visages themselves, but shadows behind them. Men and women with ice in their hair and leaves in their beards. Wolves with eyes that glowed red, not blue. Kings and queens of winter who watched their descendants from the scars they had chosen. "Don't be frightened," mothers told their children when they came running to describe what they'd seen. "They're ours. They're watching for us." "None. They're dead," some practical fathers said. "They can't hurt you. They're rooted," the grandmothers would correct. "There's a difference. Mind your manners around the trees. They remember how you speak of them." In the deep, strange space along the world's wound, Lyanna and Liara and the others listened. They listened to the thud of human hearts over their roots. They listened to the whisper of boots on snow, the clash of steel, the murmur of prayer. They listened to the restless shift and sigh of the ancient cold beyond, the slow, half-dreaming turn of powers older than any kingdom. They listened to the maester's quills, scratching, writing, and rewriting the stories of men who thought walls of stone would last forever. Time wears everything. Wounds scar. Scars fade. New wounds open. They knew, watching from their strange vantage, that the world would not stay as it was. Someday, distant and dim, another wall would fall. Perhaps the roots would hold then. Perhaps not. Perhaps new powers, dragons, shadows, sorcerers, and distant lands would rise and warp the old patterns. They could not see everything. They did not need to. They had chosen in their time to stand between winter and the world. They had not done it perfectly. No one ever did. They had bled, burned, bound themselves to roots, and held the line for generations. Under the red leaves, where sap ran like slow blood and memory was as thick as snow in the heart of winter. They waited. For hoofbeats. For the creak of ice. For the laughter of children playing in the yard of a castle that had outlived them all. For a boy or a girl to sit with their back against a heart tree and close their eyes and say, "All right then. Show me," they would answer. They always had. Anyway, in the far south, in a city of pale stone and warm breezes, a boy read about winter. He sat in a high, arched window of the citadel, his legs dangling over the dizzying drop to the harbor below. The scent of salt and tar and fish rose faint, but constant. Gulls wheeled white and gray against the blue. Sunlight warmed the page under his hands. The book was old and stiff-backed, its leather cracked, its pages stained. Someone had painted a wolf on the front long ago, the lines blurred now by time. The script inside was northern, cramped, angular, written in ink that had browned almost to rust. The boy's name was Aran, and he had never seen snow. He turned another careful page. "Artos, called the rooted king," the text read, "did lay himself down beneath the heart tree at the foot of the wall that was, and let his blood water the roots. Thereby was bound a scar across the world, whose pain he bore until his daughter Lyanna came to him in the roots and took half his burden. So it was that the north did not fall, though the others beat upon it with cold and corpses for 3 generations." "Mary, Denda," Aran frowned. "Scar across the world," he muttered. "Cold and corpses, no dates, no measures, no mention of the effect on trade." He flipped back to the front of the book to check the colophon. It was unsigned, as most northern chronicles were, but a neat southern hand had added a note centuries later, copied in Winterfell from older records, by Maester Tommen, accuracy subject to question. Northerners prone to exaggeration. Aran smiled faintly. He liked Maester Tommen. The old man's other works were full of careful measurements of snowfall and crop yields, of the number of dead in various winters, of the distance between holdfasts and the time needed for ravens to fly from one to the next. Tommen had a mind like a set of scales. Yet here, at the bottom of the page, the same hand had added a single, small line. "They believe this," Tommen had written, "even when they laugh, especially then. That in itself is important." Aran shut the book and rested his forehead briefly against the worn leather. The citadel's bells told the hour, a soft cascade of sound. "Aran!" a voice called from the corridor beyond. "Aran? Are you in there?" Archmaester Malos is looking for you. You've missed 2 lectures on leechcraft already. Aran swung his legs back in and hopped down from the window, tucking the book under his arm. Dust motes spun in the beam of light. His bare feet slapped the cool stone as he stepped through the doorway. "I'm coming," he called back. "Tell him I was reading." The novice in the hall, Thomas, pink-faced and perpetually anxious, rolled his eyes. "You're always reading," he said. "You'll end up with more ink than blood if you're not careful." "Better ink than leeches," Aran said. "Did Malos say why he wanted me?" Thomas shrugged. "Something about your questions," he said. "He doesn't like them. He doesn't like being wrong," Aran murmured. "Neither do you," Thomas said. They hurried along the curving corridor, past alcoves full of statues and shelves full of scrolls. The air grew cooler as they descended toward the inner courts. In the distance, the forge clanged, the sharp ring of hammer on metal echoing. The tang of hot iron threaded the salt. Aran's thoughts were still northward, to snow and wolves and heart trees. The Wolf Book, he called it in his head. It was supposed to be a minor curiosity, just one more chronicle from a land the South preferred to think of as distant and stubborn. But something about the way the words sat on the page, stubborn and certain, had hooked him. They believed this. Especially then. The leechcraft lecture was as tedious as he expected. Archmaester Malos was a heavy man with a voice like damp wool. He droned about the proper placement of leeches on various parts of the body, about the humors, about removing bad blood to make way for good. Aran watched the dark, glistening creatures wriggle in their bowl and thought about other things that drank blood. "Wirewoods," he said aloud, without meaning to. The room's murmurs stilled. Malos's bushy eyebrows rose. "Pardon, novice." Aran blinked. "Forgive me, Archmaester," he said. "I was thinking of another application." Malos sniffed. "I would hope so. Bloodletting is not to be mixed with superstition. We are healers, not hedge witches." Aran hesitated. "But blood is blood," he said. "If there is virtue in taking it from a man's arm to cure him, might there not be some effect in giving it, as the Northerners claim? They bleed their trees to keep winter's worst at bay. Maester Tommen's accounts." "Maester Tommen," Malos interrupted, "spent too long in the cold. He let northern fancies frost his reason. We are not here to humor old wives' tales." His gaze sharpened. "Nor to waste time with questions you know how I will answer." Aran's mouth went dry. "Yes, Archmaester," he said, and swallowed the rest. That night, he went back to the Wolf Book. He opened it at random and read. "There must always be a Stark in the roots," it said in one passage, squeezed into the margin as if the scribe had thought of it late and could not bear to leave it out. "Not only in Winterfell's halls. The old kings and queens lie beneath the heart trees to hold the scar. If they fail, winter comes again, and not the kind you can sleep through." "Mantrei." Aran traced the words with his thumb. He had grown up in the Reach, in a small village between Old Town and High Garden, where his father tended vineyards and his mother baked bread. Winter, to him, meant rain and the occasional frost that turned the fields silver. They had vines to prune and casks to check. Wolves were something you heard in songs. The idea of a winter you could not sleep through, because sleep would kill you, because the cold would reach into your lungs and turn your breath to knives, was both terrifying and oddly compelling. He imagined snow higher than the citadel's walls. He imagined blue-eyed dead men marching along the Honeywine. He imagined white trees with red leaves drinking the blood of kings. He shut the book and leaned back against the shelf, staring up at the rafters. Shadows from the lantern made strange patterns on the stone. "You'll freeze your mind reading that rubbish." The voice came from the doorway, amused. Aran looked up sharply. Archmaester Malos stood in the entrance, his chain glinting. Beside him was another man, unfamiliar. This one was taller, leaner, with hair gone mostly to iron gray and eyes the color of old ice. He wore no chain, only a black cloak with a faint gray direwolf stitched at the breast. Aran's heart kicked. "Your Grace," he blurted before he thought. "Or your Lordship?" The man smiled faintly. "Just Stark will do," he said. His voice had the North in it, the slow, deep rumble. "The South stopped calling us kings a long time ago." Malos cleared his throat. "Aran," he said, "this is Lord Cregan Stark of Winterfell. He's come to the Citadel seeking a maester. Specifically, a maester who knows how to read more than his own belly. I suggested you, for my sins." Aran set the book down carefully and rose. "My lord," he said, and bowed. Cregan Stark studied him. "You're young," he observed, "but you have ink on your fingers and dust in your hair. Those are good signs." Aran remembered his manners belatedly. "If you'll forgive me, my lord, I was just reading." "The Wolf Book," Cregan said. "I saw the cover." His mouth twitched. "My grandfather commissioned that copy. He thought if he sent enough of our stories south, someone here would take us seriously." "Some of us do," Aran said before he could stop himself. Malos sighed softly. "You see," he told Cregan, "always questions, always opinions, always winter in his head. Perhaps you'll be able to put them to use." Cregan's gaze sharpened. "You believe the tales?" he asked Aran. "About the walls fall? The rooted kings?" Aran swallowed. "I believe," he said carefully, "that people do not bleed and bury their rulers for no reason. Not for generations. Not if it did nothing." "Good," Cregan said simply. "Pack your things then. If you want to see whether the stories are true, you'll have your chance. You're coming north." Aran's mouth fell open. "North," he stammered. "As in Winterfell, the wall that was. Snow." "As in all of that," Cregan said, amused. "Unless you'd rather stay here and argue with Malos about leeches." Malos harumphed. "The boy hasn't even forged 3 links yet," he protested. "He's not ready to wear the chain of the Citadel. To send him off now is exactly what the Citadel does with all its half-finished maesters," Cregan said. "You send them to lords who need them. I need one who can read my grandfather's scribbles and argue with me about what they mean." He looked back to Aran. "What do you say, boy? Do you want to see snow?" Aran's heart hammered. He thought of his father's vineyards, of sun-warm earth and green leaves. He thought of the Wolf Book, of Ardos and Lyanna and Liara, of scars across the world. "Yes," he said, "I do." The voyage north took longer than the stories ever mentioned. Aran had time to regret his choice several times over as the ship that bore them beat up the coast, its sails snapping in winds that grew colder each day. He was not a good sailor. The sea did not care. "You'll get your land legs back," Cregan said, watching him lean greenly over the rail. "Assuming they don't freeze off first." They docked at White Harbor under a sky the color of dirty wool. Snow fell in slow, heavy flakes, melting when they hit the warmer water of the harbor, clinging where they touched stone. The city's white walls were gray with slush. Men and women trudged through the streets in cloaks and furs, heads down, breath steaming. Aran shivered even under the heavy cloak he bought in Old Town. "This is autumn," Cregan said, amused. "Wait until you see real winter." White Harbor's lord, Wyman Manderley's great-great-grandson, also named Wyman and just as round, welcomed them with fish and hot stew and bread baked in the shape of little wolves. "I had them make that for you," he told Cregan, chuckling. "So you don't feel too far from home." "That's a lot of wolves," Cregan said dryly, eyeing the table. "The roots will be jealous." Aran listened, fascinated, as they spoke of trade and weather and levies. The winter had been mild by northern standards so far, they said. Snow earlier than in the last 2 years, but less than in the old days. The dead had not walked in a decade. The last time whites had been seen in any number was in Cregan's father's youth, when a barrow had broken open near last hearth, and the umber had turned it into a bonfire. "We still burn our dead," Wyman said with a shrug. "Hard habit to break, even if half the Citadel calls us mad for it." "They'll call you worse if you stop," Kragan replied. From White Harbor they rode. The King's Road north was a gray ribbon between snow-dusted fields. Farms huddled close to it, their roofs thick with thatch and frost. Men paused in their work to watch the small party pass. Kragan and his household guard, a half-dozen men in gray and white, Aran in Citadel brown, his cloak already crusted with rime. A few wagons with supplies. Nights were spent in holdfasts and inns that got smaller and rougher the farther they went. In some, they slept in shared rooms with smoke-blackened beams and hounds under the tables. In others, the only roof was the one they carried with them, canvas over poles, flapping in the bitter wind. Aran saw his first heart tree 3 days past the last river. It stood on a little hill beside a frozen stream, alone amid leafless oaks. Its bark was white as bone. Its leaves, few and shrunken in the cold, were the color of dried blood. A face was carved into its trunk, 2 deep-set eyes, a long, straight nose, a mouth that might have been smiling or grimacing. The party drew rein without quite meaning to. Kragan dismounted and walked up the hill, snow crunching under his boots. He knelt before the tree without ceremony, bowing his head. His men followed suit in varying degrees of formality, some dropping to one knee, others merely dipping their heads. Aran stayed where he was. "Are you coming?" Kragan called over his shoulder, his breath smoke in the air. "Or are you afraid the tree will eat you?" Aran flinched. He swung down from his horse, hugging his cloak tighter, and trudged up the hill. The heart tree loomed above him. Up close, the carved face looked less like a face, and more like deep grooves in the bark, worn smooth by centuries of wind and touch. Sap had run from the carved eyes long ago, staining the trunk. He felt nothing. No thunder, no whisper, no rush of visions. Just cold. The bark under his palm was smooth and chill as stone. "Disappointed?" Kragan asked quietly. Aran exhaled, steam puffing from his nose. "I don't know what I expected," he said. Voices. Tingle. "No, the old powers don't perform on command," Kragan said. "They've had their fill of that." His gloved hand patted the bark. "This one's an outlying route. They're quieter away from the thick places. Here you're more likely to feel your own bones than theirs." "You make it sound like a network," Aran said. "One tree linked to another." Kragan's mouth crooked. "You read the wolf book," he said. "You tell me." Aran remembered the descriptions of the scar, of Artos and Lyanna and Layara sitting in a place that was not a place, feeling roots spread under the whole north. He shut his eyes and pressed his palm harder to the bark, willing himself to feel it. For a heartbeat, the cold sharpened. He glimpsed, perhaps, a flicker of red not from leaves, but from something deeper. A sense of downward, of dark, of wood growing through stone and soil. A whisper, so faint he could not make out words if there were any. Then, it was gone. He opened his eyes. His breath came faster. "Something?" Kragan asked. "Maybe," Aran said. Suggestion." He huffed out a laugh. "The maesters would tell me it was my imagination." "They always do," Kragan said. "Come on. Winterfell is still 2 weeks off. Plenty of time for your imagination to freeze solid." "Hey." Winterfell rose from the snow like an old gray beast. Its outer walls were thick and squat, built of weathered stone that did not care about wind or time. Steam rose in faint plumes from certain places. The hot springs, Aran realized, the ones the book had mentioned. Inside, towers jutted at odd angles, new built atop old, a haphazard forest of gray. As they rode through the gate, the smell of wood smoke and baking bread wrapped around them. Hounds barked. Stable boys ran to take the horses. Men and women in gray wool cloaks watched with a mixture of curiosity and wary pride. "Lord Stark," the steward intoned as Cregan swung down. "Welcome home." "Maester," Cregan said, nodding to an old man who stood near the yard's edge. His chain gleamed in the weak light. "This is Aran. He's yours." The maester, Henley, by the look of his smooth iron link and the raven perched comfortably on his shoulder, peered at Aran. "You're thin," he said. "Do they feed you in Old Town, or do they think knowledge can be eaten like bread?" "Both," Aran said cautiously. Henley snorted. "We'll fix that. Come, boy. The Rookery's drafts will make you feel right at home." "Noani, and Amaya." Aran settled into Winterfell as best he could. He learned the ravens' names and the paths of the walls, the quirks of the gates, and the schedule of the kitchens. He learned where smoke seeped up through the stone from the springs below, making certain corridors unexpectedly warm. He learned the faces of the household, the lady, tall and sharp-eyed, the younger sons, boisterous, the servants, efficient and blunt. He learned, most of all, the godswood. It drew him in odd moments when his duties were done or his head was full of too many numbers. He would slip away, cloak drawn tight, and walk under the bare branches until the red leaves of the heart tree appeared ahead, a bright wound in the white. Sometimes Cregan was there, kneeling in the snow. Sometimes one of the children, Illyria, the youngest, with hair like black straw and a laugh like bells, would be lying on her back under the tree, staring up through the branches. "You talk to them," Aran said once, when he came upon her and found her lips moving soundlessly. She blinked, then grinned. "They talk to me," she said. "Sometimes. Mostly they just hum." "Like a song?" he asked. "Like a hive," she said. "Lots of little voices. They buzz." She tilted her head. "They liked you, you know." Aran's heart stuttered. "Who?" "The roots," she said. "When you touched them on the road, they said, 'Ah, a southerner who listens. That's rare.'" He swallowed. "They said that." "In their way," she said. "They don't use words much." She rolled onto her stomach, propping her chin on her hands. "Have you seen her yet?" "Her?" "The Root Queen," Illyria said. "Liara, or Lyanna, or both. They blur together sometimes. Old Lyanna's deeper, younger Liara's brighter. They're like two candles held together." Aran's fingers tightened on his cloak. "I have not," he said slowly. "I don't dream that way." "You will," Illyria said confidently. "Soon. They're curious." That night, he dreamed. He stood in a grove of white trees. Snow lay deep underfoot, crisp and unbroken. The heart trees surrounded him, their faces watchful. The air smelled of sap and cold. Two figures sat at the base of the largest tree. One was a woman with hair tangled with leaves and eyes as white as bone. Roots coiled around her like jewelry. The other was a younger girl, her face carved in lines that were both delicate and hard. She too had roots in her limbs, though they seemed to fit her more lightly. "You took your time," the older one said. Aran's mouth went dry. "I didn't mean to," he said. "You did," she said. "You read, you thought, you doubted, you came. That's a kind of meaning." The younger one leaned forward, studying him with eyes that were both gray and bright. "He's soft," she said. "But there's something under it." "I'm Aran," he said, because names were something solid he could hold on to. "Aran of no great house, novice of the Citadel, maester in training." "Lyanna," the older woman said. "Of House Stark, rooted queen. You've read about me." He nodded, swallowing. "Liara," the girl said. "Also Stark, also rooted. Foolish, you've read about me too." He nodded again. "You You're real. Leanna's mouth curved. What did you expect? I don't know, he said. A metaphor, a story, a scar in the world as a concept, not as people. We were people, Liara said. We still are, just stretched. Aran looked around. Is this the scar? Part of it, Liana said. It's the shape we give it so your mind doesn't break trying to look at it. Her blind eyes studied him. You're trembling. It's cold, he said. It's not, Liara said. Not here. That's you, bringing your body with you. You'll learn to leave it behind. Why am I here? He asked. Because he needed to ask something. Liana tilted her head. Because Kragan brought you, she said. Because the Roots wanted to see what sort of mind the South was forging these days. Because there is a question coming that needs someone who knows both ink and blood. Nega, Admiral. A question, he repeated. About the bargain, Liara said. About how long we lie here. About whether there is another way. Aran felt as if he stood on the edge of a very high, very narrow wall. What bargain? He whispered, though he knew. Liana's hand, thin and bark pale, brushed the roots beside her. We hold the scar, she said. We keep the cold from pouring through. We did it because there was no time to find another way. We did it because someone had to lie down in the dirt and let the trees grow through them. My... Hamo. We thought, Liara said, that it would be for a while. A long while. A few generations. We didn't think about forever. Aran swallowed. Has it been? Forever? Long enough, Liana said quietly. Long enough that my own memories and the trees blur. Long enough that I cannot always tell whether I am recalling my father's face or some long-dead king's. Long enough that we have forgotten what it feels like to walk. Nah, no. He looked down at her roots, at the way they merged with the trees, indistinguishable. Why tell me? He asked. What can I do? You can write, Liara said. You can think. You can argue with men who don't listen. You can help Kragan answer when the South asks him to cut us down. Aran's chest tightened. The South. They've begun already, Liana said. Not here. Not yet. But elsewhere. Little Godswoods, far from the scar. A tree here. A tree there. They're only trees, men say. What did they ever do for us? They want the land for plows. For septs. For pretty gardens. Something like fire flickered in her blind eyes. They forget why the old kings drew lines and said, no axe passed here. They forget the dead, Liara said. Aran thought of Malosai. Old wives' tales. Northern fancies. The Citadel won't listen to me, he said. They might, Liana said. If the right man reads you. If the right woman remembers a story you wrote when she is cold and afraid and looking at a tree that hums. And even if they don't, Liara added, the roots will. They have long memories. Nay. He licked his lips. What is the question then? He asked. The one you said is coming. Liana smiled, sad and sharp. Whether there must always be a Stark in the roots, she said. Or whether, for once, the North can share the burden. He woke with sap on his fingertips. It was sticky, faintly red, clinging to the pads of his fingers like honey. He sat up sharply in his narrow bed in the maester's tower, heart pounding. The Merlin outside his little window was crusted with frost. Dawn light crept pale over the yard. Aran swung his legs out of bed and put his feet on the cold stone. His mind felt stretched. The days that followed were full of small signs. Ravens flew in from the scattered northern holds, with reports that felt like echoes of old news. A pack of whites had been seen near the long lake, moving sluggishly, their blue eyes dim. A white bear had attacked a hunting party near Carhold. Its fur smoked when steel touched it. Frozen mists clung to the barrows near the last river for 3 days longer than they should have. Nothing we haven't handled before, Maester Henley said, scratching notes in the margin of his ledger. Small things, cleaned up quickly. Small cracks, Kragan muttered, standing by the window. They become big ones if you don't mortar them. He rode to the worst of the places himself. He took Aran with him. On the second night out, they camped under a low hill where a gnarled, stunted weirwood clung to the rock. Its branches were few, its leaves sparse, but its roots dug deep. Kragan sat with his back against it, eyes closed. Aran hesitated, then sat beside him. "You dreamed," Kragan said after a while. Aran swallowed. "Yes." "Lyanna?" Kragan asked. "Liara?" "Both," Aran said. "They spoke of a question. About you. About us." Kragan's jaw tightened. "I wondered when they would," he said. "I felt them stirring, more than usual." "You're not surprised," Aran said. "I've been waiting for this my whole life," Kragan replied. "Ever since my father told me the stories and my grandmother told me the ones he left out. There's always been a sense of, not an end exactly, a point. A time when we would have to decide whether we lie down in the dirt again or stand up and say, no more." "And what do you want to say?" Aran asked quietly. Kragan was silent for a long moment. "I'm tired of burying my blood," he said. "Artos, Brandon, Lyanna, Liara. Names in the roots, faces in the leaves. We tell their stories over and over, so we don't forget. But telling them means remembering what they did, what they lost." His hand pressed against the bark. "I don't want to tell my children that one of them must go to the trees. I don't want to stand in this grove and watch another Stark sink into roots." "Nah." Aran's heart beat faster. "Then, you won't?" "If it were only about me, I'd say no," Kragan said. "But it's never only about us, is it? That's the trouble with being a Stark. Everyone else's winter becomes your problem." He opened his eyes and looked at Aran. "So," he said, "you've read more about the old bindings than any man living. You've spoken to the ones in the roots. Tell me, Maester, not yet. Is there another way to hold the scar?" Aran's mouth went dry. "I don't know," he said honestly. "The Wolf Book, your grandfather's notes, they suggest the first binding was improvised. A desperate answer. The children of the forest once wove magics through trees without giving themselves wholly. They used blood, yes, but not their whole selves. If those magics can be rediscovered, you think the children will come back and give us lessons?" Kragan asked wryly. "No," Aran said. "But the trees remember. Lyanna said so. They remember everything. Perhaps there is a way to coax those memories forth without another full rooting. A way to anchor the scar to more than a few minds." He drew a breath. "To many, to all who kneel." Kragan frowned. "A sharing." "Yes," Aran said. "In old tales of the first men there are references to the singing of the woods when whole clans gathered to call the cold back. Perhaps, if enough of the north knelt in their gods' woods at once, giving blood freely, binding themselves lightly, the roots could spread the burden." "Lightly," Kragan repeated. "Not like Lyanna, not like Liara. Not unto death," Aran said. "Not unless they choose it. But a thread, a tie dimmed. Enough that when the cold presses there are not 2 or 10 hands at the scar, but thousands. 10,000. A choir, not a duet." "Nay." Kragan stared up at the stunted weirwood. "And you think the roots will accept that?" he said. "After tasting king's blood for so long." Aran remembered Lyanna's wide eyes, Liara's wry grin. "I think," he said, "they're as tired as you are." Kragan huffed out a breath that might have been a laugh. "Convince them," he said. "You're their maester now. Convince the roots. Convince the north. Convince the south not to cut down the very trees we need for this. If you can do that, boy, I'll gladly take not another Stark in the roots as an outcome." "No." The first effort was small. They started in Winterfell's God's Wood. On the night of the first full moon of deep winter, Cregan called his household to the tree. Men and women and children knelt in the snow, cloaks wrapped tight, lanterns flickering. Aran stood before them, clutching his notes, his breath steaming. He had written letters to every major house in the north explaining the idea in careful terms. Not sorcery, but a ritual practice, a sharing of burden. Some had answered with enthusiasm, others with skepticism, a few with outright insults. You want us to bleed ourselves more than we already do. Lord Riswell had written back. My people's backs are redded from the lash of winter as it is. They have no blood to spare for roots. It may be that sparing it now will cost you more later if you do not, Aran had replied, his hand trembling only a little. Now, in the God's Wood, his throat was dry. You all know the stories, he said. You learned them at your mother's knees. The wall fell. The dead came. Ardos and Brandon and Lyanna and Lyara bound themselves to the trees to hold the scar. They have lain in the roots for more years than any of us have lived. He swallowed. The cold presses still, less than before, but enough. They cannot do it alone forever. Murmurs rippled. We ask you, Cregan said, stepping forward, his presence steadying, for something different than we asked our grandparents. We do not ask for one of you to lie down in the roots. We ask each of you to give a little, a small cut, a drop of blood, a piece of your memory. Bind yourselves lightly to this tree, and through it to all the others. When winter comes again, as it always does, let it find the north holding not with 2 hands, but with all of ours. Done. One by one they came. Cregan went first, of course. He took the obsidian knife from Aran's hand, cut his palm and pressed it to the bark. I am Cregan Stark, he said. Son of Brandon, son of Jonel, son of Ardos. His blood ran red down the white trunk. I bind myself lightly. His lady followed, then his sons, then his daughters. The steward, the captain of the guard, the cook, the stable boys, the kitchen maids, the old woman who swept the yard and cursed at dirty boot prints. Aran went last. He hesitated a moment, knife hovering. He was not of the north. His blood had more sun than snow in it. Would the roots care? He cut his palm. It hurt more than he'd expected. His blood looked very red against the white. I am Aran, he said quietly, pressing his hand to the bark. Of no great house. Chain not yet forged. I bind myself as far as you will have me. He let his forehead rest against the trunk. And I ask you, let this be enough. The God's Wood was very silent. Then, faintly, the roots stirred. He felt it under his feet, like a sigh. A warmth climbed his arm from the bark, along the line of the cut, up into his shoulder and chest. For a heartbeat, he felt as if he had roots instead of veins. He saw flashes. Not in order. Not like a story. More like shards of glass reflecting different scenes. Artos, lying half buried in the earth, his eyes gone white, his jaw set. Brandon standing on a shattered wall, sword in hand, blood on his beard. Lyanna, laughing as she ran through snow with a wolf at her heels. Lyara, perched on the God's Wood wall, snow in her hair. He saw himself, and did not. Then it was gone. He staggered back, gasping. Maester, Illyria whispered, catching his elbow. Are you all right? Yes, he said, though his heart hammered and his head spun. Yes, they heard. They did it again, a month later, at the next full moon. Letters flew. Some northern lords copied the ritual exactly. Some modified it, mixing old words with new power. A few refused, stubborn as rock. The South, when it heard, mostly laughed. To bind oneself to a tree, one lord in the Reach scoffed in a letter Aran saw. Have the Starks finally gone mad? Will they marry the Roots next? The North is a land of superstition, another wrote. They'll howl at the moon if they think it keeps the wolves from their doors. Aran sighed and filed the letters. He kept writing. He wrote down the ritual, its words and movements. He wrote what he felt. He wrote the dreams that followed, in which he saw glimpses of other godswoods, Bear Island's twisted tree beside the gray sea, the tall, proud weirwood in Last Hearth's yard, the half-hidden one in Greywater Watch that seemed more mist than wood. He wrote of the way his own blood had seemed to sing when it touched the bark. He did not know who would read it. In the scar, Lyanna and Liara felt the difference. It was subtle at first. Where once they had felt only a handful of strong, anchored minds with them, other-rooted sensitives, stubborn, slow-burning, they now felt thousands of tiny threads. Faint, fragile, but there. When the cold pressed, those threads quivered. A man in the Barrowlands, kneeling with blood on his palm. A woman in Carhold, humming under her breath as she pressed her forehead to bark. A child in White Harbor, giggling nervously as a drop of red fell from a pricked finger. The threads tugged at the scar. Not enough to hold, not yet, but enough to take a little of the strain. Lyanna stretched herself over them, weaving them into patterns, showing the roots how to carry them. Liara darted among the threads, quick and curious, testing each for strength. "Southerner," she said once, amused as she encountered one particularly strange thread. It smelled of sea salt and sun-warmed stone. "Aran?" "He gave himself," Lyanna said. "The roots like him." "They like that, he questions," Liara said. "They're bored of certainty. They've had too much of that from us." Outside, the winters turned and eased, turned and eased. Children were born who grew up with the binding as a normal part of life. On full moons, they went to their godswoods to bleed a little and feel the faint warmth in their palms. Some felt nothing and went away disappointed. Some felt too much and left shaking. One girl in particular. Her name was Naira, and she was a Stark. She was Kragan's granddaughter, born to his second son, a quiet, thoughtful man who preferred books to battles. She had her grandfather's gray eyes and her great-aunt's habit of going where she was not supposed to. She snuck into the godswood at 7 and pricked her finger on a thorn for the first time. The jolt that ran up her arm almost knocked her over. She sat on the snow, eyes wide, while roots hummed under her. "There you are," Liara said, interested. Naira grew. She listened to the maester's stories and to the trees' whispers. She learned to ride and to read with equal competence. She snuck into the maester's tower to look at old maps of the wall that was, and at the wolf book, tracing the faded wolf on its cover. "How far did they walk?" she asked Aran once, when he was old and bent, and his chain clinked heavily on his chest. "The dead, I mean. How close did they come?" "Close enough," Aran said. "Never as far as this yard. They would have, if Ardos and Brandon and Lyanna and Liara had not done what they did." He tapped the book. "They think that's a story in Old Town. Ah, northern exaggeration. But I saw the sap on my hands once. I spoke to them. It's no story." Naira glanced at the heart tree visible through the narrow window of the tower. "Do you still hear them?" she asked. Aran smiled faintly. "Not as I did," he said. "My bones are too loud now. Old men creak. It drowns out subtler sounds. But sometimes in the very middle of the night I wake and smell snow and sap, and I know they're still there." Naira shivered, though the tower was warm. The question came to her a few years later, as Lyanna had known it would. She was 16 when her father died. It was no glorious death. No white. No battle. He slipped on icy steps and broke his neck. One moment he was standing, laughing at some joke one of his sisters had made. The next he was on the stone, his head at an angle no head should be. They burned him on a pyre in the yard. Snow fell. Wolves howled. Naira stood with her hands clenched so tight around the hilt of her sword that her knuckles went white. "Winter takes who it will," Kragan said quietly, his old, lined face grave. "We don't get to choose. We chose some, Naira said through her teeth. Artos, Brandon, Lyanna, Liara. Choices then, Kragan said. Not this. Naira stared at the flames until her eyes hurt. That night, she went to the Godswood alone. The snow was deep. Her boots sank with each step. The trees stood in silent ranks. The heart tree watched her come. She did not kneel at once. She paced in front of it, like a wolf who has not yet decided whether to bite or not. Her breath smoked. Her cheeks burned. Why? She demanded at last, glaring up at the carved face. Why him? Why them? Why any of it? The tree did not answer. The roots did. She felt them shift under her feet. An old, slow movement. The scar along the world shivered. Lyanna and Liara were there, as always. Niece, Lyanna said, her voice as soft as falling snow. You're loud. Naira's throat worked. I'm angry, she said. You can hear that. You hear everything. Liara laughed. Good, she said. We were starting to worry the line had gone soft. Naira shut her eyes. Tears burned, then froze on her lashes. I don't want to be the next one, she said. I don't want to lie down there and let the roots eat me. I don't want to be a story your maesters tell and your trees hum about. I want to live. I want to ride and fight and feel the sun on my face. I want to be more than a sacrifice. Nagi. Good, Lyanna said. We didn't either. Naira blinked. I went into the roots because there was no time to find another way, Lyanna said. I did it knowing it was unfair, that my brothers and their sons would have to make the same choice if the dead did not relent. We didn't do it so you could treat it as obligation or tradition. Her blind eyes narrowed. We did it so you might have the chance to say no. The cold still presses, Liara said. Less than before. But it presses. The scar's not gone. So you can't simply cut us down and walk away. That's not what no means. No. Then what does it mean? Naira asked, her voice breaking. Sharing, Lyanna said. Balance. Artos and I laid down our whole selves. Liara split hers. Aran and Kragan and those after them spread the weight through lighter bonds. There are possibilities, threads we did not have the energy to tug. A faint smile touched her mouth. You do. Naira's heart pounded. What threads? Southerners, Liara said. Dragons. The children's last remnants. The bits of magic in other places that have been sleeping. Your maesters catalog numbers and stars and the properties of stones. But there is power in the world they do not measure, because they think it beneath them, or too dangerous. You can make them look. No. Me? Naira said, incredulous. I'm a girl with a sword and a bad temper. I can barely make my brothers sit down to supper. Starks, Liara said, with affectionate exasperation. We never see ourselves clearly. Lyanna's voice softened. You don't have to decide today, she said. Or tomorrow. Or this year. We're not breaking yet. We can hold. But when the time comes, and it will, the question won't be, will you bury yourself? It will be, what will you build instead? Naira pressed her forehead to the bark. I don't know how, she whispered. Find others who do, Lyanna said simply. They don't have to be Starks. You have the roots. Use them. She did. It took time. Naira grew into her anger and out of its wildest edges. She learned to sit in council, to weigh grain counts against sword counts, to decide which banners to call and which to leave be. Kragan died as even the hardiest men do. Naira's aunt took the seat for a while, a steady, pragmatic woman who valued full granaries over threatening words. When she too passed, the choice of successor was muddled. The North had grown used to shared burdens. The bindings under the trees had, over the decades, developed their own quiet politics. Some houses felt the roots pull more strongly. Some resented it. Some were proud. There were whispers that the next Stark to sit Winterfell's high seat should be one who could hear the trees clearly. Naira could. Reluctantly, she took the wolf-carved chair. She did not lie down in the roots. Instead, she wrote. With Aran's help, though his hands trembled and his eyes watered, he still remembered how to shape words. She drafted a series of letters addressed not to individual lords, but to the citadel, to King's Landing, to whatever southern seat currently imagined itself the center of the world. In the north, she wrote, we have long carried a burden alone, the weight of a winter that would fall on all, if it fell. We have done this with blood and roots, with fire and loss. Our stories of the wall's fall and the long withholding are not tales to frighten children. They are history. They are warning. No, ye. She described the scar as best she could, not in mystical terms, but as a phenomenon. A line where magic, call it that, or call it some unknown property of the world, had been bent to hold back another, colder force. She wrote of the rooted kings of their choice. She wrote of the more recent, lighter bindings, of the way many small offerings could share the strain. She asked, bluntly, for help. Your maesters, she wrote, know much of herbs and numbers. Your alchemists play with green fire and smoke. Your septons talk of souls. Beyond the narrow sea, there are those who speak to shadows and to fire. Across the far eastern deserts, there are cities whose very stones are said to drink sorcery. Somewhere in all of this, there may be a way to strengthen the scar that does not require more of my blood lying blind under trees. Some letters were ignored. Some were mocked. A few were read by people who mattered. In Old Town, an old man with a chain heavier even than Aran sat in a tall chair and read Naira's words through narrowed eyes. Magic! One of the younger archmaesters scoffed when the letter was passed around. More northern fancies. They want our help baking their snow tales. Perhaps, the old man said, or perhaps they sit on something real. We dismissed the tales of dragons until they burned down half a city. We dismissed the tales of the long night until we found ice crystals in layers of old stone far deeper than any winter we knew. He tapped the parchment. We are supposed to seek knowledge, not comfort. In King's Landing, a queen whose foremothers had once flown dragons sat in a solar that smelled of lemons and ink and frowned at the same words. The North tries to frighten us, one of her lords said. They want more grain, more coin. They want not to die, the queen said. There's a difference. She stared out the window at the bright blue bay. My great-grandmother told me stories of snow falling in this courtyard, of a cold that crept in under doors that had never known it. It passed, but she never forgot it. She wrote back. In distant Ashai, where the very shadows had weight, a man with eyes like burned-out coals tasted a scrap of Naira's words in a dream and hummed thoughtfully. The cold she spoke of smelled like certain things he knew and feared. Slowly, questions woke. Not all were helpful. Some southern vultures saw opportunity in northern fear. They send ravens offering to build new kinds of walls for a fee, to send experts in faiths that would guarantee safety. Naira burned those letters unread. Others, though, came with sincerity. A maester in Pentos wrote of ancient Valyrian experiments with stone and fire, of how dragonflame had once been used to seal cracks in the earth. A red priest in Volantis spoke of a different kind of fire that burned cold things. A sailor from the Summer Isles sent a tale of an island where no winter ever came, no matter how the winds blew, because something in the ground drank the chill. Naira gathered them like pieces of a broken blade. She sat under the heart tree with parchment spread in her lap, roots humming under her, and tried to fit them together. What if, she said aloud one night, chewing the end of her quill. We've been thinking of the scar as only a wound, but wounds can be healed if treated, or replaced, walled with other things. Liana's presence curled around her thoughts. We carved this with what we had, she said. Ice, stone, blood. Roots, if you have more, use it. We do, Naira murmured. Dragonstone still steams. There are volcanoes far in the east, Glass candles burn in the citadel. There are sources of power we've ignored or feared. She tapped the page. What if we thread some of them into the scar? Not just roots, other anchors. Be careful, Liara said. Last time men played with fire and ice together, half the world cracked. Naira smiled crookedly. We'll be careful, she said. We have you to shout at us if we're not. The first experiment was small and symbolic, more a test of will than of magic. Nira invited Southrons to Winterfell. They came, curious and wary. A red priest in scarlet robes, his eyes bright with zeal. A maester from Old Town with a ring of Valyrian steel in his chain, earned by study of the old empire's workings. A woman from Myr who called herself an alchemist and smelled faintly of strange herbs and burned sugar. They stood in the godswood, shivering. Cold. The Myrish woman muttered, rubbing her gloved hands. Why in all the gods' names do you live here? Someone has to, Naira said. The red priest smiled, his breath steaming. Cold is the absence of Uralor's grace, he said. We bring his light. The maester cleared his throat. We bring knowledge, he said, clearly feeling as if he needed something equally grand to say. And I bring my nose, the alchemist said. If anything smells like it's about to explode, I'll tell you. Nira knelt before the heart tree. She cut her palm. The blood dripped red. I am Naira Stark, she said, of Winterfell. Bound to the roots, but not buried in them. I ask the old gods to listen. She looked up at the red priest. And I ask your god, she said. Fire's god, to listen too. The priest's eyes shone. You would invite Uralor into your old wood, he asked. Many of your people would call that blasphemy. Many of my people would call lying down in the roots madness, Naira said. We did that anyway. She inclined her head. Will you lend me your light? He stepped forward. His hand shook a little as he held it over the cut in her palm. His lips moved in a prayer Rand did not recognize. The air grew warmer around him. Not much, but enough that frost melted on a nearby branch. The maester stepped up as well, placing his hand beside the priest's, his Valyrian steel ring touching Naira's skin. The alchemist set a small glass vial at the base of the tree, where the blood had dripped, and carefully broke it. A faint, shimmering smoke rose, smelling of spice and something metallic. Aran watched, heart in his throat. Nothing exploded. The heart tree shivered. In the scar, Lyanna and Liara felt a new taste. Fire, not like the crude kind men lit in hearths, but deeper. Focused. Dragon-like, but not. It threaded through Naira's blood, through the roots, through the tiny fragments of Valyrian steel in the maester's chain, through the red priest's fervor, through the alchemist's strange vapors. It touched the scar. For an instant, the line that had been only red and blue, heat and cold, life and death, flared with an additional color. Gold, or something like it. Shard stirred. His cold slid along the scar, testing this new thread. It recoiled, not in pain, but in puzzlement. He did not know this taste. It did not burn as fire burned, nor crack as ice cracked. It changed. He retreated, thoughtful. Naira gasped. Her palm burned, then cooled. She felt a surge of something rush up her arm into her chest. For a heartbeat she smelled ash and roses. Then it was gone. The alchemist sniffed the air, eyes wide. Interesting, she murmured. Very interesting. The red priest looked as if he had seen a minor miracle. R'hllor's light has touched your old gods, he said, awed. They did not reject it. The old gods are not easily offended, Naira said, breathing hard. They've had to watch men do worse than this. The maester scribbled frantic notes. It was not a solution. The scar did not suddenly become invulnerable. The dead did not crumble. The winters did not stop. But something had shifted. The bindings under the heart trees grew more complex. Nera and those who came after her wove in what they could. Fire when it could be coaxed without burning the roots. Stone with veins of strange ore that sang when touched. Symbols carved with dragon glass and Valyrian steel, linking old and new. The scar thickened. When shard or drift or needle pressed, they found a barrier that was no longer single-textured. It did not simply resist. It flexed. It absorbed. Sometimes it even twisted their own cold back on them, letting it run in circles until it wore itself thin. There were still cracks. There were always cracks. Men still forgot. Trees still fell. Some in the south continued to despise the old magics and tried to stamp them out where they could. But the roots had more hands now. More minds. More kinds of power poured into them. The Starks remained in the roots. Lyanna and Lyra did not rise. Nera in time joined them, not because she was forced, but because she chose to see the scar from the inside. She lay down under the heart tree, an old woman with scars on her arms and laughter lines around her eyes, and the roots took her gently. "I want to see," she said. "Not just listen." She did. She saw the cold beyond the scar settle. Not entirely. It would never be entirely still. It was in its nature to move. But it moved differently now. Less like a tide, more like a current diverted. She saw men in the distant south who would never know her name shiver by a hearth and shrug it off as a draft. She saw children in the north kneel at their heart trees and press palms to bark without fear that they would be swallowed whole. She saw, in dreams, a day far distant when men would again think the long night a story, and the long withholding a myth, and the idea of bound kings and queens an unlikely song. She did not fear that as much as she once had. "Isn't that what we wanted?" she said to Lyanna once, as they sat together in the endless impossible grove of the scar. "For them to live in a world where this is story, not daily fear." "We wanted them to live," Lyanna said. "Stories are the price. So long as someone remembers why they were first told, I can live with that." Lyra snorted. "You're sentimental," she said. "Old roots." "Older than you," Lyanna retorted. In the north, in Winterfell's yard, a boy chased a girl with a wooden sword. Snow flew. Dogs barked. The air was bright and cold. "Careful," their mother called from the gallery. "You'll break your necks." "We'll land in the snow," the girl called back, laughing. "It's soft." The boy swung, missed, slipped, and fell on his back in a drift, staring up at the gray sky. He lay there, breath puffing, then grinned. "It's not that cold," he said. "Not really." In the godswood, the heart tree watched. Its roots ran deep, threading through stone and soil and old bones. They hummed with memories of winters that truly were cold, and of kings and queens who had given themselves so that this boy and girl could call this chill, not that cold. The wind shook the red leaves. They rustled like 1,000 small voices, chuckling. Under the roots, where the scar ran red and gold and faintly blue, the old kings of winter, Artos, Brandon, Lyanna, Liara, and all the rest, listened. They had fought in ancient winter for generations. They had learned, slowly and painfully, to share the burden of that fight with all the North, and with powers beyond it. They had turned a wound into a wall, and a wall into a web, and a web into something that might endure after even their names turned to dust. They did not know what new dangers the world would birth after them. They did not need to. They had set their roots deep. They had taught their children to listen. They had left behind stories thick as snowdrifts, ready to be dug into again when the next cold wind rose. There must always be a Stark in Winterfell, men still said. And, whispered more softly, in snow-laden groves and under red leaves, there must always be a Stark in the roots. The trees remembered. The North did too in its bones. For now, for this turning of the world, that was enough.